Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for being here tonight. It truly means a lot that you choose to watch this channel. I've got a spine-chilling collection of scary stories set in the rain for you to enjoy. But before we dive in, take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let the darkness take over. And hey, if you enjoy these stories, don't forget to subscribe, never miss out on any of the eerie tales that we share. Sit back, relax, and let's get started. Mia Hart moved to the quaint village of Maplewood, Maine, 3 years ago. It was everything she had ever wanted in a place to settle down, a peaceful, tight-knit community where everyone knew each other by name. Getting a teaching job at the local elementary school was the cherry on top. Small classes, polite kids, and a welcoming staff made Mia feel like she was finally living the life she'd dreamed of. But after a few months, she began to notice small, unsettling details. One student, Danny, a bright, animated child, started acting strangely. Every day he appeared more withdrawn, and his once lively eyes grew distant and clouded with fear. He flinched whenever anyone got too close, even if it was just a friendly tap on the shoulder or a hand reaching out to help. Initially, Mia thought perhaps he was having trouble at home, but when she saw the same anxious behavior spreading like a virus among other students, her concern grew. One morning, Danny came to school with a large, dark bruise on his upper arm. Mia's stomach twisted at the sight. During break time, she gently asked him what happened. He looked up at her with wide, scared eyes and mumbled that he'd fallen. Mia didn't believe him. She could see the fear dancing behind his gaze, but pushing him for the truth felt like it would break him, so she let it go for the time being. Still, she made a mental note to keep an even closer watch on him and the others who were showing signs of distress. A week later, Mia stayed late after school to grade papers. The old building felt eerily quiet, with only the buzzing of fluorescent lights and the occasional clang from Mr. Hargrove, the janitor, echoing down the long, empty hallways. It was nearly 9 p.m. when Mia heard muffled voices coming from the principal's office. It didn't make sense. Mr. Warren, the principal, had left hours ago. Curiosity piqued and nerves on edge, Mia crept down the corridor, her footsteps silent on the worn wooden floors. She pressed her ear against the cold, painted wood of the door. Mr. Hargrove's voice was unmistakable, deep and gravelly. But there was another voice too, one she didn't recognize. They spoke in tense, hurried whispers, and her heart dropped when she heard them mention Danny's name, along with others from her class. Phrases like "keep the kids quiet" and "make sure nobody finds out" sent chills down her spine. A wave of nausea washed over her as the gravity of what she was hearing started to settle in. Mia didn't wait to hear more. She grabbed her things and hurried out of the building, her mind racing with questions and a rising sense of dread. The next day, Mia found an envelope in her mailbox with no return address. Inside was a note, hastily written on plain white paper: "Stay out of this. If you know what's good for you." Her hands trembled as she read it. The words confirmed her fears. Whatever was happening at the school was dangerous, and she was now on the radar of those responsible. Determined to protect the kids, Mia started gathering evidence. Over the following days, she discreetly took notes on any odd behaviors or occurrences, trying to build a clearer picture of what was going on. She noticed certain students being pulled out of class for special sessions with Mr. Warren or Mr. Hargrove, their faces pale with fear upon their return. Without being seen, she managed to snap a few photos, shaky but incriminating, of children being led away to the principal's office, their faces tense and frightened. One night, she decided to return to the school with a small voice recorder. She hid in the closet near the principal's office, holding her breath, praying that she wouldn't be found. And just like before, Mr. Hargrove was there, along with a man she couldn't recognize. Their low voices discussed keeping the children in line and ensuring nobody speaks out. Mia's heart pounded as she recorded their conversation, knowing she had enough to go to the authorities. But as she slipped out of the closet and headed toward the exit, she ran straight into Mr. Hargrove. He stood there, his tall frame blocking the hallway, eyes narrowing with suspicion. "What are you doing here so late?" he demanded. Mia stammered an excuse about finishing grading papers, her voice barely concealing her fear, and darted out of the building before he could say anything more. The following morning, another note appeared in her mailbox. Last warning. Keep your nose out of this, or else Mia knew she was running out of time. She went to the police, handing over her notes, photos, and recordings. At first, the officers were skeptical, but once they listened to the recordings and saw the evidence, their faces turned grim, and they promised to investigate. Mia still felt a cloud of danger hanging over her head. Within days, a black car started following her as she drove home, its headlights always appearing in her rearview mirror, disappearing, and then reappearing like a ghost. One night, she woke up to the sound of shuffling feet and whispered voices outside her window. Heart pounding, she peeked through the curtains to see a dark figure standing in her yard, motionless and watching. She called the police, but by the time they arrived, whoever had been there was gone. For the next week, a patrol car was stationed outside her house, but Mia never felt safe. She was constantly on edge, her every thought consumed by the fear that she was being watched, followed, hunted. Then finally, the police made their move. In a coordinated raid, they stormed the school and arrested Mr. Warren, Mr. Hargrove, and several others connected to a child abuse ring that spanned years. The children were taken into protective custody, and Maplewood's illusion of peace was shattered. Even with those responsible locked up, Mia felt like a prisoner to her own fear. The nightmares didn't stop, and neither did the overwhelming sense that danger still lurked around every corner. She decided to leave the village, unable to bear the memories or risk her safety any longer. Moving back to the city was hard, especially leaving behind the kids she had grown to love, but it was necessary for her sanity and her life. To this day, Mia sometimes questions whether she did the right thing, but whenever those doubts creep in, she reminds herself of one simple truth: she saved those kids. She was their voice when they had none. And while the experience left scars, she knew that doing what was right had given those children a fighting chance. Jake Stanton had always dreamed of owning a classic car, and when he stumbled upon a pristine 1967 Mustang for sale in Philadelphia, it felt like fate. The car gleamed under a layer of dust in a rundown garage at the edge of town, waiting to be brought back to life. The seller, a man named Tony, seemed eager to make the sale, explaining that he needed the money quickly for personal reasons. Jake didn't press for details. The price was right, and the car looked fantastic. After a quick negotiation, he handed over the cash and took the keys, feeling like he'd just scored the deal of a lifetime. The drive home was exhilarating. The Mustang roared to life as Jake sped down the open highway, its engine purring like a lion. But the euphoria didn't last long. The next day, while stopped at a red light, a black SUV pulled up beside him. As Jake glanced over, he noticed the driver, a tall, bearded man, staring at him intensely. The gaze was cold and unnerving, and Jake quickly looked away. When the light turned green, he sped off, only to notice the SUV in his rearview mirror. It followed him for several blocks before making a sharp turn and disappearing. Jake told himself it was a coincidence, just a curious driver admiring the car. But that night, as he lay in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Around 3 a.m., he was startled awake by a noise. Someone was outside, fiddling with the car. Jake grabbed a flashlight and ran to the front door, heart pounding. By the time he got outside, there was no one to be seen, and the Mustang was untouched. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe the excitement of his new purchase was just making him paranoid. But as the days went on, the incidents piled up. Every morning, Jake would find evidence that someone had been near the car: smudges on the windows, fresh tire marks nearby, and once, even a folded piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. The note simply read, "You have something that isn't yours." Terrified, Jake tried contacting Tony, the seller, but every call went straight to voicemail. Days went by without a response, and Jake's anxiety grew. Was there something about the car that he didn't know? Was it stolen? Or worse, was it tied to something illegal? He considered going to the police, but with what evidence? A car sale, a few strange encounters, and a hunch wouldn't amount to much. One morning, after a particularly restless night, Jake found the tires of his Mustang slashed. That was the final straw. He called a tow truck and had the car taken to a local garage for repairs. Without the car around, he hoped things would calm down and whoever was following him would lose interest. But the situation only escalated. That night, Jake woke to the sound of shattering glass downstairs. He bolted upright, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it in his ears. Grabbing a baseball bat from under his bed, he crept down the stairs as quietly as possible, every floorboard seeming to betray him with its creaks. He reached the bottom and peered around the corner into his living room. Two men, dressed in black, were rummaging through his belongings. Papers, books, and furniture were being thrown aside as if they were looking for something specific. Jake's breath caught in his throat as one of the intruders, a muscular man with a scar down his cheek, noticed him. Without a word, the man lunged, and Jake swung the bat with all his strength, catching the intruder in the ribs. The man crumpled, but the second intruder, a wiry figure with piercing eyes, pulled out a knife, slashing wildly. Jake backed up, narrowly avoiding the blade, his adrenaline surging. With nowhere to run, Jake fought back, swinging the bat like his life depended on it. He managed to strike the knife from the man's hand, and in the struggle, they both crashed to the ground. In the chaos, Jake pinned the man down, hitting him until he stopped moving. His hands shaking uncontrollably, he fumbled for his phone and called the police. Within minutes, the police arrived, arresting the two intruders. As Jake sat on the front steps of his house, still clutching the bat, he tried to explain everything: the strange encounters, the slashed tires, and the car that seemed to be at the center of it all. The officers listened intently, and after some questioning, they assured Jake they'd investigate further. The next day, Jake received a call from Detective Sullivan, who had news that would turn his world upside down. The men who broke into his home were part of a criminal gang involved in smuggling. Tony, the car's previous owner, had been a member of the gang and had hidden something inside the Mustang, a package worth a small fortune. Jake's heart sank as the detective explained that the gang believed he knew about the hidden stash and was trying to claim it for himself. The detective warned Jake to stay somewhere safe until they could locate the rest of the gang. Jake didn't need to be told twice. He packed his things and stayed with a close friend in a neighboring town, laying low while the police continued their investigation. The Mustang remained at the garage, and that was just fine with Jake. He wanted nothing to do with it anymore. Weeks later, Jake got a call informing him that the police had arrested several gang members and recovered the hidden stash from the Mustang, several kilos of illegal drugs. Though relieved, Jake felt sick to his stomach. The car, which had once seemed like a dream come true, had brought nothing but danger into his life. He decided to sell the Mustang as soon as it was returned to him, unwilling to take any more risks. After finally selling the car, Jake did everything he could to move on. He changed his phone number, moved to a new apartment, and started piecing his life back together. It took time, but the fear eventually faded. And while he never fully regained the joy he once felt at the sight of a classic car, he learned a valuable lesson sometimes. The things we desire most can carry hidden dangers beneath their shiny surface. Karen Harlow had always been drawn to unique jewelry, especially vintage pieces that told a story. So when she found a stunning antique necklace on Craigslist, delicate, silver filigree with a sparkling sapphire pendant, she knew she had to have it. The price was surprisingly reasonable for such an exquisite piece, but the seller, a woman named Marla, insisted she needed to make the sale quickly. Karen didn't mind. The necklace felt like fate. The two arranged to meet at a bustling cafe in downtown Phoenix. It was a bright Saturday morning, and the cafe was filled with the comforting hum of laughter, coffee brewing, and quiet conversation. Marla, a woman in her mid-30s, sat near the window, casually dressed but with a tense smile. When she handed Karen the necklace, its beauty exceeded all expectations. Karen felt an instant connection, like the piece was meant for her. After a bit of small talk and handing over the cash, Marla departed quickly, leaving Karen excited to show off her new treasure. That evening, Karen wore the necklace to her birthday dinner, where it drew admiration and compliments from everyone. It felt like magic around her neck, as though it gave her some newfound elegance and charm. But the next few days were far from enchanting. It started with small, strange occurrences, a feeling of being watched, the sensation of someone trailing her when she was out shopping, and one night, her car alarm going off in the middle of the night without any sign of forced entry. Karen dismissed these incidents as coincidence. After all, big cities were full of odd happenings. One night, as she was preparing for bed, she heard a soft noise coming from outside her ground floor apartment window. It was the unmistakable sound of someone trying to open the window latch. Panic set in, and she froze, straining her ears. The noise continued for a few tense moments before suddenly stopping. Karen peered through the blinds but saw nothing in the darkness. She convinced herself it was just her nerves playing tricks on her, and managed to fall into a restless sleep. The next day, an uneasy feeling hung over her like a cloud. She decided to take the day off work to stay home and keep an eye on her apartment. Around midday, as she sat by the window pretending to read, she saw a man standing across the street, wearing a hoodie and sunglasses. He loitered for far too long, hands in his pockets, and his gaze never left her apartment. Karen's heart raced, and she watched him until, after what felt like an eternity, he walked away. That evening, she received a text message from an unknown number enjoying the necklace. It felt like a punch to the gut. How did they know? She immediately replied, asking who it was, but there was no response. Desperate for answers, Karen called Marla, but the phone rang and rang without an answer. She left a frantic voicemail explaining the situation, asking if she'd given her number to anyone. Several hours later, there was a knock on the door. Karen's stomach turned as she approached, but it was Marla standing on the other side. She looked nothing like the calm, collected woman Karen had met at the cafe. Her eyes were wild, and she seemed on the verge of tears. "We need to talk," Marla said urgently, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. The words tumbled out in a rushed, terrified whisper. The necklace wasn't just a vintage piece. It had belonged to a dangerous man, someone from Marla's past, someone she had been trying to escape. Desperate to cover her tracks, Marla stole the necklace from him and sold it to Karen, hoping to disappear and start fresh. But now it seemed he had found out, and he was coming for them both. The gravity of the situation crashed down on Karen like a tidal wave. She felt trapped, her pulse quickening, as she realized she was entangled in something far more sinister than she could have imagined. "We need to go to the police," Karen said, her voice wavering between panic and resolve. At the police station, they spilled everything: the sale of the necklace, the anonymous message, and the looming threat of the dangerous man Marla was trying to escape. The officers took their statements seriously and advised them to stay somewhere safe while they investigated. It was a small comfort, but the uncertainty and fear overshadowed any sense of security. Karen and Marla agreed to stay at a friend's house on the outskirts of town, far from the city and the prying eyes that seemed to follow them. The house was a small, secluded place in the desert, surrounded by miles of emptiness. It felt safer but eerily isolating. The first night was restless. Every sound of the desert wind felt like a warning. Every creak of the old house made them jump. By morning, both women were on edge, exhausted but too terrified to sleep. As they discussed their next steps over breakfast, Marla suddenly remembered an old safe deposit box where she had hidden documents that could help the police track down her ex, the man who owned the necklace. It was a long shot, but it might be the key to ending their nightmare. They agreed to make the risky journey back to the city to retrieve the documents. The drive was tense. Every car behind them felt like a shadow of danger. At the bank, Marla retrieved the documents without incident, and for a moment, it seemed like everything would be okay. But as they left, Karen noticed a familiar figure lurking in the parking lot, the same man in the hoodie and sunglasses. She grabbed Marla's arm, her voice a hoarse whisper: "We need to go. Now." They raced back to the car, hearts pounding, and sped away before the man could approach. Back at the house, they handed over the documents to the police, who assured them that it would only be a matter of time before they could locate Marla's ex. That night, though, the isolation of the desert became suffocating. The wind howled like a warning, and every creak of the house set their nerves on edge. The next morning, they were jolted awake by the sound of breaking glass. He had found them. Karen's heart felt like it would burst out of her chest as she grabbed the nearest heavy object, a lamp, and the two women ran toward the back door. But he was already inside, his face twisted in a mask of rage. Marla screamed, and Karen swung the lamp as hard as she could, catching him off guard. He staggered, and they bolted, barricading themselves in a bedroom and shoving furniture against the door. Minutes felt like hours as he pounded on the door, shouting threats. Karen fumbled to dial 911, her hands shaking so badly that she nearly dropped the phone. The sound of sirens in the distance was the sweetest relief she'd ever heard. The man's shouts turned into curses and then silence as he realized his time was up. The police arrived and stormed the house, arresting him before he could escape. The ordeal was over, but the trauma lingered. Karen and Marla decided it was best to part ways for their own safety, and Karen moved to a different apartment, changed her number, and did everything she could to rebuild her sense of security. Every so often, she would hold the necklace, a hauntingly beautiful reminder of the danger she narrowly escaped, and wonder how a simple online purchase could lead to such a terrifying ordeal. For now, the necklace sits in a box, locked away. A memento of a story she hopes never to relive, and a reminder that sometimes beauty hides the most dangerous of secrets. Isabelle Dawson was looking for a fresh start when she moved to the small town of Clearview, Ohio. It seemed like the perfect place to leave her past behind, a place where everyone knew each other, and strangers were greeted with warm smiles. She quickly found a job as a waitress at the local diner, and within weeks, Isabelle felt like she belonged. The friendly regulars, the hum of small-town life, it was just what she needed to start over. One evening, a man named David came into the diner. He was charming, handsome, with dark hair and a smile that made Isabelle's heart race. He began coming in regularly, sitting at the counter, asking about her day. Their conversations flowed naturally, and it wasn't long before he asked her out on a date. Thrilled, Isabelle accepted. David seemed perfect, too perfect, almost. Their relationship moved quickly. David was sweet, attentive, always knew the right thing to say, and could make Isabelle laugh no matter how her day went. He confided that he too was new to town, looking to start fresh after some trouble back in his home state. He never elaborated, and Isabelle didn't push for details. After all, everyone had their past. One night they were watching a movie at David's small apartment, the kind of cozy evening that Isabelle had always dreamed of. But then there was a loud knock at the door. David's face turned ashen, and he motioned for Isabelle to stay quiet. He went to the door and spoke in hushed, urgent tones with whoever was on the other side. She couldn't make out much of the conversation, but words like trouble and leave cut through the whispered exchange. When David returned, he brushed it off with a strained smile. Just a friend who needed help, he explained, but Isabelle could see he was shaken. The rest of the night, David kept glancing at the windows as if expecting something or someone to appear. Over the next few days, David's anxiety seemed to grow. He became jumpy, always glancing over his shoulder when they were out, and ignored most of his phone calls. When Isabelle pressed him about what was wrong, he would change the subject, assuring her it was nothing to worry about. But the unease gnawed at her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that David was hiding something. One afternoon, while cleaning tables at the diner, Isabelle overheard a conversation between two regulars. They were discussing a recent news story, something about a fugitive wanted for serious crimes who had supposedly fled to another state. Isabelle's heart sank as the description they gave matched David: perfectly tall, dark hair, and piercing blue eyes. Her stomach twisted in knots. Could it really be him? Had she fallen in love with someone dangerous? That night, determined to confront him, Isabelle drove to David's apartment. But as she opened the door, she found him hastily packing a bag. He froze when he saw her, a mix of fear and desperation in his eyes. "I have to go, Isabelle," he admitted. "I didn't want to lie to you, but my past is catching up with me," he confessed to being on the run, trying to start a new life to escape the consequences of his past mistakes. He begged her to leave with him, to start over somewhere far away. For a moment, Isabelle considered it. She'd dreamed of running away before, but not like this, not running from the law, from danger. Torn and terrified, she told him she needed time to think and rushed out, promising to call him later. She drove around aimlessly, her mind racing. What if he was innocent? But what if he wasn't? Finally, logic won over emotion. Isabelle went straight to the police station, where she told them everything she knew about David. The officers were serious, instructing her to stay somewhere safe for the night while they handled the situation. Isabelle called a close friend and arranged to stay over. Around midnight, Isabelle's phone rang. It was David, his voice frantic and filled with fury. He knew she had gone to the police. "You betrayed me," Isabelle, he shouted. "I trusted you," his words sent a chill down her spine. "I'm coming for you," he said, the line going dead right after. Isabelle's friend immediately called the police, and they huddled together in the dark living room, every sound from outside making them jump. Minutes felt like hours. And then came the loud banging on the door. David was outside, pounding with all his might, screaming her name and demanding she let him in. Isabelle's hands shook as she grabbed a kitchen knife, ready to defend herself if he broke through. The banging grew louder, more frantic. The wooden door creaked under the pressure of his pounding fists, and Isabelle could hear the desperation and anger in his voice. Just as she thought the door might give way, sirens blared in the distance, filling the night with a burst of red and blue lights. David's shouts turned into frantic curses, and then silence. Moments later, police officers burst through the front door, pulling Isabelle and her friend to safety. David was wrestled to the ground and handcuffed, still shouting her name as he was taken away. Relief washed over Isabelle, but so did a deep sadness. The man she had fallen for, who made her laugh and feel special, was gone, replaced by a criminal she could no longer trust. The officers thanked her for coming forward and assured her she had done the right thing. But as the adrenaline faded, all Isabelle felt was heartbreak, fear, and an unsettling uncertainty about her future. In the days that followed, Isabelle stayed with her friend, trying to piece her life back together. The small town was rocked by the news, and while people were supportive, she couldn't help but notice the pity in their eyes. It was hard to move on, to face the whispers and the stares, but she knew she had to keep going. She focused on her job, leaned on her friends, and slowly began to find her footing again. David's trial came and went swiftly. He was sentenced to a long prison term for crimes Isabelle couldn't bring herself to ask about. The details didn't matter. All she knew was that he was gone for good. The experience left Isabelle wary and cautious. Trust didn't come easily anymore, but she learned to trust her instincts, to value her own safety above all else. And though the small town's closeness sometimes felt suffocating, it also meant she had support when she needed it most. Slowly but surely, she built her life back up, one day at a time, determined to never again let her guard down. Though she had found a fresh start in Clearview, it wasn't the one she'd envisioned. But she was strong, and she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them head on, stronger and wiser for having survived the nightmare. Jake Connors was strapped for cash, and his old motorcycle seemed like the quickest way to make some money. It wasn't much a red Honda with a few dings and a bit of rust, but it was reliable and perfect for someone who knew their way around a bike. He put an ad up on Craigslist and didn't have to wait long for a response. A guy named Ryan reached out within the day, and they quickly agreed to meet. Ryan showed up right on time, a tall, seemingly friendly guy with an easy smile. He took a short test ride around the block, and when he came back, his grin was ear to ear. "It's perfect," he said, handing Jake a stack of bills. They shook hands, exchanged paperwork, and Jake handed over the keys. It felt good, clean, and simple. Jake was happy the sale went smoothly. But things didn't stay simple for long. A few days after the sale, Jake got a text from Ryan. "Hey, this bike you sold me, it's got some serious problems. You didn't mention anything about a bad carburetor or the brakes being this worn down." Jake was surprised. The motorcycle had been running fine before he sold it, and he told Ryan as much. He offered to help out and suggested a mechanic he trusted, But Ryan wasn't having any of it. The messages became more aggressive. "You sold me a lemon. I want my money back." Followed by, "I know where you live." Trying to keep calm, Jake blocked Ryan's number and hoped that would be the end of it. But a sinking feeling settled in his gut, a feeling that told him Ryan wasn't going to go away quietly. That night, Jake found himself glancing out the window more than usual. Around midnight, he saw a car parked down the street, one that hadn't been there before. His heart sank as he saw the faint glow of a cigarette through the driver's window. He closed the blinds and went to bed, trying to convince himself that it was just his imagination. The texts, however, didn't stop. "I'll make you pay for scamming me," one message read, despite the blocked number. It seemed that Ryan was using multiple numbers, each message getting more threatening than the last. Jake didn't sleep much that night, every creak and rustle in the house amplifying his anxiety. The next day, as Jake was walking home from work, he noticed the car again. Parked right outside his apartment building, Ryan was behind the wheel, glaring at him. Jake's heart raced as he quickly went inside, locking the door behind him. A chill of fear gripped him. This wasn't just about a bike anymore. Ryan was clearly unhinged. A week later, after countless sleepless nights, Jake decided he couldn't take it anymore. He called the police, hoping they could help. The officer on the other end listened carefully but seemed unconvinced of the seriousness of the situation. "Unless he actually does something illegal, there's not much we can do," the officer said. It wasn't the comfort Jake was looking for, but he felt a small sense of relief that someone at least knew what was going on. That relief was short-lived. The following evening, as Jake was heading home from a friend's house, he noticed the door to his apartment was slightly open. A cold sense of dread washed over him. He cautiously stepped inside, and his blood ran cold. The place was a disaster. Drawers were pulled out, papers and clothes were strewn everywhere, and it was clear someone had been searching for something. In a panic, he called the police again. When the officers arrived, they took in the scene, but no fingerprints or direct evidence linked Ryan to the break-in. It could be a random burglary, one of them suggested, but Jake knew better. He didn't have any valuables worth stealing, and the way everything was torn apart, it felt personal. Unable to stay in his apartment that night, Jake packed a bag and went to stay with a friend. He felt trapped, constantly looking over his shoulder, unsure of what might happen next. For the next few days, the car outside his building was gone, and for a fleeting moment, Jake allowed himself to relax, hoping maybe Ryan had given up. That illusion was shattered one night when, at his friend's place, Jake woke to the sound of movement outside the window. He crept over and peeked out, and there was Ryan, standing in the yard, staring directly at him. A wave of panic washed over Jake as he woke his friend and dialed 911. This time, the police arrived quickly. Ryan tried to make a break for it, but he was caught just as he was attempting to break in through the back door. Ryan was arrested on charges of stalking and attempted burglary. At the police station, Jake found out that Ryan had a long history of petty crime, harassment, and violence. During the court proceedings, Jake had to face his stalker and testify about everything that had happened. It was terrifying, but a weight lifted from his shoulders when the judge sentenced Ryan to time behind bars. Even after Ryan was locked up, it took Jake a long time to feel safe again. He moved to a new apartment, changed his phone number, and stopped answering ads from strangers online. Selling the motorcycle had been meant to give him some quick cash, but it had almost cost him his peace, his safety, and, he feared, maybe even his life. As Jake reflected on everything that had happened, he vowed to trust his gut and be more cautious in the future. And while he never heard from Ryan again, the experience left a permanent mark, a reminder that sometimes, even the simplest of transactions can lead to the most dangerous of encounters. Max felt a bittersweet twinge as he watched the man sail away in his old boat. It wasn't anything fancy, just a sturdy fishing vessel he'd had for years, anchored at the marina in Minneapolis. But life had become expensive, and selling it seemed like the smart choice. It wasn't long before a buyer came forward, a man named Drew, who seemed genuinely enthusiastic about the boat. They met, shook hands, exchanged cash, and Max watched as Drew sailed his old pride and joy into the distance. He thought that would be the end of it. But just a week later, Max received a call that set his nerves on edge. Drew's voice was no longer friendly. "There's an issue with the boat's paperwork," Drew claimed. "I need to meet you to sort this out." Max was surprised but agreed to meet at a nearby diner the next morning. When he arrived, Drew wasn't alone. He was sitting with a man who immediately gave Max a bad feeling, a tough-looking guy with a shaved head, wearing dark sunglasses. Drew greeted Max politely enough, but the tough guy's silence spoke volumes. As they sat down, Drew leaned in and said quietly, "There are some missing documents, and we need access to a particular compartment on the boat. It requires a key." Max was confused. "What key? I gave you everything when you bought the boat." Drew exchanged a tense look with his partner before insisting that Max accompany them to the marina to check it out. The marina felt eerily empty as they walked along the dock toward the boat. The wind blew cold, and the smell of the lake seemed more pungent than usual. Max tried to keep his composure, but his gut was screaming that something wasn't right. Drew pointed to a small hatch on the boat's deck that Max had never paid much attention to. "There's something in here we need to access," Drew said, his voice edged with impatience. Max knelt to open the hatch, but before he could even touch the latch, the tough guy grabbed him from behind, shoving him roughly into the boat's cabin. Max tried to fight back, but the guy was stronger, and in a matter of seconds, Max was tied up, his hands bound behind his back. He was shoved into a corner as Drew and his partner tore through the boat, searching frantically. "What are you looking for?" Max demanded, struggling against the ropes that held him. But they ignored him, their eyes darting around the cabin as if they were on a time limit. Finally, they found what they were looking for, a hidden compartment beneath a loose floorboard. Drew pried it open, and Max's eyes went wide as he saw the packages inside bricks wrapped tightly in plastic. It hit Max like a wave. Drugs. And not just any drugs, there were enough packages to suggest they were worth a small fortune. Max's mind reeled. He had owned this boat for years, never knowing it had been used by a smuggling ring before he bought it. He realized now that Drew wasn't just a friendly buyer, he was part of that ring, and he thought Max was trying to double-cross him by hiding the stash. "What are we going to do with him?" the tough guy growled. Max's pulse raced as they whispered heatedly, clearly debating his fate. "Let's just leave him tied up. He won't be a problem," Drew finally decided, his voice hard with authority. They threw a tarp over Max, leaving him hidden in the cabin. "If he talks, we'll find him," Drew said before they climbed out and started making their way off the boat. Max's heart pounded. He knew he couldn't stay there helpless and waiting to be found by the wrong people. Struggling against the ropes, he managed to free one hand, then the other. He listened for any sounds outside the cabin, holding his breath. When he was sure they were gone, Max grabbed a rusty knife from a compartment in the cabin, cutting the rest of the ropes that bound his legs. He peered out of a small window, and when the coast seemed clear, he snuck up onto the deck, every creak of the boat's wooden floor making his stomach twist with fear. Stepping onto the dock, Max bolted, not daring to look back. He ran straight to his car and drove to the nearest police station, adrenaline surging through his veins. When he explained everything to the officers, they were skeptical at first, but when he described the drugs in the hidden compartment, their expressions changed. A team of officers was dispatched to the marina immediately, and Max was left sitting in the police station, his leg bouncing nervously as he waited for news. Hours later, they returned with a grim update. Drew and his partner were gone, but the boat and the drugs were still there. They had disappeared before the police could catch them. Max was placed under protective custody for the next several weeks as the police worked to piece together the smuggling ring. He couldn't sleep every time he closed his eyes. He saw Drew's face, heard the tough guy's threats. He moved around constantly, staying in motels and with friends, never staying in one place long enough to feel safe. Eventually, the police broke the case. They tracked down Drew and his partner, along with several other members of the smuggling operation. But Max still felt uneasy. The thought that he had been inches away from being killed or left to rot on that boat haunted him. When the police returned the boat, Max refused to take it back. It was tainted now, nothing but a floating nightmare. He sold it as quickly as possible, this time vetting the buyer carefully and providing full disclosure about what had happened. Max had no intention of letting the boat or anything associated with it ruin his life any further. Max moved on, but the experience changed him. He became hyper-aware of everything he bought and sold, never trusting strangers easily again. And whenever he passed by the marina, a shiver would run down his spine, reminding him of the boat that almost cost him everything. Julie had finally decided to sell her old camera equipment. It had been sitting in her closet for months, and she could use the extra cash. She posted an ad on Craigslist, an old but well-maintained DSLR camera, a few lenses, and some accessories. Almost immediately, a young man named Mike reached out. He said he was a photography student in need of a good camera for his classes and offered to meet her the next day at a coffee shop in Midtown Manhattan. When Julie arrived at the cafe, she saw Mike sitting at a small table in the back, with a backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked about 20, with a friendly smile and tousled hair. After they exchanged greetings, he examined the camera thoroughly, asking questions about its use and commenting on how well she had taken care of it. Julie was relieved it all seemed legitimate, and Mike seemed genuinely excited about buying the camera. "Perfect," he said with a grin. "Let's make the deal." He offered to pay her through a money transfer app, and while they waited for the transfer to go through, Mike suggested they grab a coffee. Julie agreed, not suspecting a thing. They sat down at the table, lattes in hand. Mike kept the conversation going, talking about photography, classes, and his dreams of becoming a photojournalist. Julie enjoyed the chat, sipping her coffee as Mike spoke with enthusiasm. But as the minutes passed, she started to feel off. Her head began to spin, and a wave of dizziness hit her out of nowhere. She tried to focus on Mike's face, but her vision blurred. The last thing she remembered was him leaning forward, his face a mask of concern, and his voice echoing faintly, "Hey, are you okay?" Julie woke up in a dark alleyway, her head pounding and her mouth dry. The taste of coffee still lingered, but now it was mixed with a foul metallic taste. She was lying on the cold ground, disoriented and terrified. Struggling to her feet, she patted her pockets. Empty. Her phone, wallet, keys, everything was gone. And of course, so was the camera. It took a few minutes for Julie to gather herself. She stumbled out to the nearest street, found a cab, and directed the driver to the closest police station. When she arrived, she was shaking. The officer on duty listened to her story, taking notes as she explained how she had been drugged, robbed, and left in the alleyway. They took her statement and promised to investigate, but the look on their faces was clear they had seen this before, and it wasn't going to be easy to track down the thief. For the next few days, Julie felt violated, paranoid, and jumpy. She borrowed a phone from a friend to try and follow up with the police, but there was little progress. It could take time, they said, offering her standard reassurances. Meanwhile, Mike had disappeared, no trace, no connection, nothing she could find. But Julie wasn't ready to give up. She spent hours on her friend's laptop, scouring online forums and groups for any similar incidents. There were stories of Craigslist scams, thefts, and druggings, but nothing quite like her own. It was as if Mike had perfected his act to leave no trail behind. Days turned into a frustrating blur, but then a tiny lead emerged. She found a photography community forum where someone had mentioned seeing a young man who matched Mike's description, frequenting the very coffee shop where they had met. Julie went back to the cafe, her heart racing as she questioned the staff. One of the baristas remembered him. "Yeah, I've seen him a few times before," he said, "always sitting at the same table, alone. Real friendly guy. I thought he was a student or something." Julie's pulse quickened. She was getting closer. After some pleading, she convinced the cafe manager to let her review the security footage. For hours, she sat in the back office, watching the grainy footage from the last few weeks. And then, there he was, Mike, clear as day, examining the camera at the table, just as he had done before drugging her. She took a photo of the screen with her friend's phone and rushed to the police station. With the image in hand, the police were able to escalate the investigation. They released a bulletin with his face, hoping someone would recognize him. A week went by without any word, and Julie tried to resume her normal life. But every time she saw a young man with a backpack, her heart would race, her mind flashing back to that cafe, the coffee, and the feeling of helplessness as everything went dark. Finally, one night, the call came. "We found him," the detective said. Julie's breath caught in her throat as she hurried down to the station. The man in the holding cell was unmistakably Mike, the same friendly face, the same tousled hair. And yet now, he looked different, his smile gone, replaced by a look of cold indifference. The police had raided his apartment and found a trove of stolen goods, cameras, laptops, phones, things he'd taken from other unsuspecting victims like Julie. The sense of relief was overwhelming, but so was the sadness. This wasn't just about a camera, it was about the betrayal of trust, the violation of safety, and the feeling of being preyed upon by someone who seemed so genuine. Mike was charged with multiple counts of robbery, assault, and drugging victims. During his trial, it became clear that he was a professional con artist, targeting people online and luring them into false senses of security. Knowing she wasn't his only victim brought Julie some comfort, but it didn't take away the nightmares or the paranoia that lingered long after. The camera was returned to her, but she couldn't bring herself to use it. The sight of it only reminded her of the fear and the darkness of that alleyway. Eventually, she sold it to a trusted friend, choosing to let go of the past in hopes of moving forward. In the end, Julie stopped using Craigslist and other peer-to-peer selling platforms. The experience left a lasting impact, one that made her more cautious, more skeptical, and in many ways more guarded against the dangers hidden behind a friendly smile. The streets of New York, with their bustling energy and endless possibilities, felt a little less safe. But Julie learned to keep her eyes open, trust her instincts, and above all, protect herself from the shadows hiding in plain sight. Rachel had been working as the night receptionist at the Riverside Inn for nearly 2 years. Most nights were uneventful, checking in late travelers, handing out spare keys, and offering coffee to road-weary guests. The small town of Green Valley wasn't known for its excitement, which was just the way Rachel liked it. But that all changed one cold October night when the stranger checked in. It was nearly midnight, and the lobby was empty when the man came in. He wore a long, dark coat, and his face was hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. When he finally looked up, Rachel was struck by his pale, gaunt face and sharp, piercing eyes. "Room 213, he said, without any greeting, his voice low and quiet. Rachel didn't think much of it. People were always tired at that hour, but something about him sent a shiver down her spine. She handed him the key, offering a forced smile. "Have a good night, sir," she said. He didn't respond, just took the key and made his way up the stairs, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. Rachel watched until he disappeared from view, an uneasy feeling settling in her chest. The night dragged on slowly. The lobby's silence was broken only by the ticking clock on the wall and the occasional creak of the old building. Rachel couldn't stop thinking about the man in room 213, and she found herself glancing at the security monitor that showed the hallway leading to his room. The screen flickered, showing an empty corridor, but the eerie feeling persisted. Around 2 a.m., Rachel heard the sound of footsteps, quick, frantic, echoing down the hallway. She looked up just in time to see a figure sprinting out the front door. Confused and alarmed, she rushed to the door but saw no one. The man had vanished into the night. When she turned back to the security monitor, the screen was blank, static buzzing loudly. Rachel's hands trembled as she tried to adjust the screen, but the signal was gone. It was as if someone had cut the feed. Trying to shake off her fear, Rachel sat back down and forced herself to focus on the front desk work, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that something was very wrong. At around 3 a.m., she noticed that the key for room 213 was sitting on the counter. The man hadn't come back for it. Had he left it behind when he ran out? Was he planning to come back? She didn't know what to think. Rachel decided to investigate. She grabbed a flashlight and made her way up the narrow, creaky staircase to the second floor. The hall was dimly lit, and the silence was oppressive. As she approached room 213, she noticed the door was slightly ajar. Swallowing her nerves, she knocked softly. "Hello? Is everything okay?" There was no answer. Pushing the door open, Rachel's flashlight beam revealed a room in disarray, sheets pulled off the bed, a lamp knocked over, and scattered clothes across the floor. It looked like there had been a struggle. The bathroom door was closed, and she hesitated before slowly turning the knob. When she opened the door, the smell hit her first metallic and sharp. The beam of her flashlight revealed a horrifying scene, blood splattered across the tiles, the mirror cracked, and signs of a violent fight. Rachel's stomach churned, and she stumbled backward, her mind racing with questions. Where was the man, and who did all this? Heart pounding, Rachel ran back down to the lobby and called the police, her voice shaking as she described the scene in room 213. Someone's been hurt, or worse, she said, struggling to keep her composure. The dispatcher assured her that officers were on their way and told her to stay put. Within minutes, sirens blared outside, and a team of officers rushed into the inn. They combed through room 213, examining every inch of the scene while Rachel watched, her anxiety only growing as the night wore on. Eventually, Detective Harris, a grizzled officer with a stern demeanor, pulled Rachel aside to ask her questions. She described the man who had checked in, the noise she'd heard, and the sight of him fleeing into the night. Detective Harris nodded, jotting down notes. "There's no sign of the man who rented the room," he said. "And we haven't found a body." Rachel's confusion deepened. No body? Then who did the blood belong to? And where had the man gone? The police continued to investigate, scouring the hotel and its surroundings. As the sky lightened with dawn, they found something disturbing in the alley behind the inn, a bloody knife, discarded carelessly behind a dumpster. The detective grimly confirmed that it matched the blood found in room 213. They dusted it for fingerprints, but it seemed like the man had been careful. There were none. Days passed, and Rachel struggled to return to normal life. The inn felt different, its once comforting silence now felt suffocating. Every guest who walked through the door made her tense up, wondering if they were dangerous. She replayed that night over and over in her head, trying to make sense of it all. The police continued their investigation, but leads were scarce. The man had left no trace behind, no identification, and no record of his stay. A week later, just as Rachel was starting to hope that maybe the man had left town for good, a letter arrived for her at the inn. It was written on plain, unmarked paper, and simply read, "I'll be back for what's mine." There was no signature, no indication of who had sent it, but Rachel knew. It was him. She showed the letter to the detective, who assured her that they would keep a closer watch on the inn, and that they were doing everything they could to find the man. But Rachel felt no comfort in those words. She knew that whoever he wasn't done with her or room 213. The next few months were tense. Rachel considered quitting, but she couldn't afford to leave her job. Every night, as she sat behind the front desk, she would look up at the security monitor, dreading the possibility of seeing that man's face again. And every time she walked past room 213, she felt a chill run down her spine, a feeling that the room was still occupied by whatever dark presence the stranger had left behind. She never knew if he would actually come back, or if the threat in the letter was just a way to terrify her into sleepless nights. But Rachel knew one thing for sure: the man in room 213 was not just a traveler passing through. He had come to the Riverside Inn for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it was still lurking in the shadows, waiting to reveal itself. Liam loved to hike. It was his way of unwinding from the stress of city life, escaping into the serene wilderness, and losing himself in the quiet embrace of nature. He had explored most of the trails around Asheville, North Carolina, but one had always intrigued him: the Black Hollow Trail. Known for its dense forests and secluded pathways, it was described as beautiful but somewhat eerie. Locals spoke about how it was easy to get lost there, and some said the trail had a spirit of its own. But Liam wasn't one to shy away from an adventure. One Friday morning, he set out early with his backpack, fully stocked for a day hike. The trailhead was nearly empty, just how he liked it. As he started the hike, the forest felt alive. The morning mist hung in the air, and sunlight struggled to break through the dense canopy of trees. The only sounds were the chirping of birds and the soft crunch of his boots against the fallen leaves. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. About 2 hours into the hike, Liam reached a fork in the trail. He knew the path to the left would loop back to the main trail, but the one to the right seemed to lead deeper into the woods. He felt a strange pull to explore the right-hand path. It wasn't marked on any of the trail maps he'd seen, which only made it more enticing. As he ventured deeper, the path narrowed, overgrown with wild ferns and moss. The forest became denser, the air cooler. Liam loved it, the sense of discovery, of going where few had gone before. But after another hour, he started to feel uneasy. The birds had stopped singing, and the forest around him was eerily silent. A light wind rustled through the trees, creating a faint whispering sound, almost like voices. Liam laughed it off, telling himself it was just the wind playing tricks on his ears. But as he continued, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. He paused to take a drink of water, scanning the woods around him. For a brief second, he thought he saw movement, a dark figure darting between the trees, but when he focused, there was nothing there. Just shadows and branches. A shiver ran down his spine, but Liam pressed on, determined not to let his imagination get the best of him. But the deeper he hiked, the more the forest seemed to close in around him. The path became harder to follow, and he realized he hadn't seen a trail marker in over an hour. It was getting late, and the sun was starting to set, casting long, creeping shadows across the forest floor. Liam finally admitted to himself that he was lost. He cursed under his breath, trying to remember his way back to the main trail. He took out his phone to check the map, but there was no signal. And that's when he heard a faint sound coming from behind him. It was rhythmic, almost like footsteps, but just slow enough to be unsettling. He spun around, expecting to see another hiker, but the path was empty. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing through the stillness. There was no reply. He told himself it was just an animal, but deep down, he felt it was something else. Deciding not to waste any more time, Liam turned back, heading the way he came, his pace quickening with every step. The footsteps seemed to follow him, always just out of sight and always in rhythm with his own. His heart pounded in his chest as he pushed through the undergrowth, desperately trying to find the fork in the trail that would lead him back to safety. But the forest seemed to have shifted around him. Every tree looked the same. Every turn led to more dense, dark woods. He was disoriented, the panic setting in. Just when Liam felt completely lost, he stumbled upon a small clearing. And there, in the center, was a small cabin, old, worn down, with moss covering the wooden walls. It looked abandoned, but Liam was desperate for some sign of life, some clue to guide him out of the woods. He approached the cabin cautiously, noticing the windows were covered in grime, and the door was slightly ajar. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open, the rusty hinges creaking loudly. The interior was dark, but Liam could make out a table, a few chairs, and what looked like a bed covered in a dusty blanket. He stepped inside, hoping to find a map, a radio, anything to help him. As he walked further in, he saw something pinned to the wall, a series of old photographs. And as he moved closer, his blood ran cold. The photographs were of hikers, men and women, taken on this very trail. Some were smiling, posing with their backpacks. Others looked more candid, taken from a distance. But in every photograph, there was a dark figure lurking in the background. And in the last photograph, taken just days ago, Liam saw a familiar face, his own. He was standing at the trailhead, setting out for his hike, and there, in the background, was the same dark figure. Heart pounding, Liam backed away from the wall, his mind racing. How was this possible? He had been alone when he started his hike, hadn't he? Before he could process the fear, the door behind him slammed shut, and the room was plunged into darkness. Panicking, he fumbled for his flashlight, the beam illuminating the dusty cabin as he frantically searched for a way out. But then he saw movement in the corner of the room, A shadow detached itself from the darkness, growing taller, closer. Liam felt a hand on his shoulder, cold, firm, inescapable. He spun around, trying to break free, but the flashlight slipped from his grasp and clattered to the floor, its light spinning wildly. The last thing Liam saw was the glint of a blade, and then everything went black. 3 weeks later, hikers found Liam's backpack discarded near the trailhead, but there was no sign of him. The local authorities searched the forest for days, but the only thing they found was the old cabin, empty and abandoned. And inside, pinned to the wall, was a new photograph, a picture of Liam, taken just moments before he vanished into the woods. To this day, no one knows who or what stalks the Black Hollow Trail, but the locals will tell you once the forest claims you, it never lets you go. Diane had been working at the Red Oak Motel for just a few months. It was a typical roadside place off the highway in rural Tennessee, hosting truck drivers, travelers, and the occasional drifter passing through. The work was quiet, sometimes even boring, but Diane didn't mind. That was until one summer night when the man in room 8 checked in. It was nearly 11 p.m. When he arrived, a tall man in his 40s with scruffy hair and an unshaven face that looked like it had seen years of hard living. He didn't have any luggage, just a small, worn-out backpack slung over his shoulder. One night, he said bluntly, sliding a stack of cash across the counter. He didn't give a name, and Diane didn't ask. After all, she had seen plenty of guests like him, people who wanted to keep to themselves. She handed him the key and watched as he made his way down the narrow walkway to room 8. The rest of the night passed quietly. Diane sat behind the counter, half-heartedly watching late-night TV and listening to the distant hum of trucks speeding by on the highway. Around 2 a.m., just as she was about to start her rounds to check the motel, she noticed a peculiar sound of rhythmic tapping, like someone was banging lightly on the walls. At first, she dismissed it as just the sound of the building settling, but it continued tapped faint but insistent. Diane walked outside to see if she could figure out where the noise was coming from. She followed the sound down the dimly lit walkway until she found herself standing in front of room 8. The tapping was coming from inside. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the door. Was the man in trouble? Was he trying to get someone's attention? But when she pressed her ear to the door, all she could hear was a muffled shuffling and what sounded like low, panicked whispers. She knocked lightly. "Sir? Is everything all right in there?" No response. Diane's heart began to race as she knocked again, louder this time. "Sir?" The tapping stopped abruptly, and for a moment, everything was dead silent. Diane held her breath, waiting for something, anything but the silence stretched on. After a few long seconds, she turned away, planning to call her manager and let him handle the situation. But then she heard the unmistakable sound of a lock clicking open. She spun around just in time to see the door to room 8 swing open slightly, revealing only darkness inside. Diane's instincts screamed at her to back away, but she called out one more time, her voice shaky. "Sir, are you okay?" Slowly, a hand reached out from the darkness, pale and trembling. And then a voice, hoarse, desperate, whispered, "Please, help me." Before Diane could react, the hand was yanked back inside, and the door slammed shut. Diane ran back to the front desk, her fingers fumbling as she dialed 911. She explained the situation to the dispatcher, her voice barely steady. Within minutes, 2 police cars pulled into the lot, their flashing lights casting blue and red hues over the otherwise empty motel. Diane met the officers outside and quickly led them to room 8. They knocked loudly, identifying themselves as police. "Sir, open the door," one of the officers called out, but there was no response. After a tense few moments, the officers forced the door open, guns drawn, ready for anything. Diane stood behind them, her heart pounding as she strained to see what was inside. The room was a mess, furniture overturned, blankets strewn about, and the small table in the corner smashed to pieces. But what struck Diane most was the smell, a strong, metallic scent that filled the air. The officers scanned the room with their flashlights and quickly found the source: blood. It was everywhere on the walls, the floor, and pooling near the bathroom door. The officers moved cautiously toward the bathroom, pushing the door open with a loud creak. Diane tried to look away but found herself staring, unable to tear her eyes from the horror that might await. But to everyone's surprise, the bathroom was empty. No sign of the man, no sign of a body, just more blood. The officers quickly radioed for backup, and more police arrived to search the area. They combed the motel, the surrounding woods, and even checked the nearby highway, but there was no trace of the man who had checked into room 8. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, leaving only chaos and blood behind. After the police finished their initial investigation, they allowed Diane to close the room and tape it off. She felt a chill down her spine as she locked the door, the key feeling heavy in her hand. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had witnessed something terrible, something she could never quite explain. The next day, Diane tried to get back to her routine, but she couldn't stop thinking about the man's plea for help and the terror in his voice. She spoke to the police again, but they had no updates, no body, no identity, and no clear answers as to what had happened in that room. They only advised her to stay vigilant and let them know if anything else strange occurred. A few days later, as Diane was cleaning up after another long shift, she found something odd near the back entrance of the motel. It was a piece of crumpled paper, soaked from the rain, but still legible. She carefully opened it and saw that it was a hand-drawn map of the motel. A red X was marked right over room 8, and next to it, written in shaky handwriting, were the words "It will happen again." She felt the blood drain from her face as she handed the note over to the police. But there were no fingerprints, no clues, just another unsettling piece to an already baffling puzzle. The motel became the talk of the town, and guests soon stopped booking rooms. Some said the place was cursed, while others whispered about the man in room 8, claiming they saw him wandering the woods at night, still searching for something or someone. Diane eventually quit her job at the motel, unable to shake the fear that came with every shift. The Red Oak Motel soon closed down, abandoned and left to rot by the side of the highway. Travelers would pass by, often slowing down to catch a glimpse of the boarded-up windows and the overgrown parking lot. But to this day, no one really knows what happened to the man in room 8. And when the wind howls on a stormy night, locals swear they can hear a faint tapping like someone knocking, trying desperately to be let back in. Ethan was used to riding his bike at night. After long shifts at the warehouse, there was something therapeutic about riding down empty streets, the hum of the tires on the asphalt, and the cool breeze against his face. Living in a small town just outside Austin, Texas, gave him miles of open roads to enjoy after midnight. But one Friday night, his usual route took a chilling detour, one that would leave him questioning his very sanity. That night, the air was crisp, and the moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the deserted streets. Ethan pulled on his helmet, strapped on his backpack, and set out like he always did, taking a winding road that cut through a dense stretch of woods. It was a road he had ridden dozens of times, but tonight felt different. The forest seemed darker, the trees thicker, and the silence more oppressive. About 15 minutes into his ride, Ethan spotted something unusual, a car parked on the side of the road, hazard lights flashing. It was a silver sedan, and the driver's door was wide open. Slowing down to a stop, Ethan debated whether to check it out. Maybe someone needed help? He called out, "Hello?" Anyone there, but got no response. He hesitated, then parked his bike and walked closer. As he got within a few feet of the car, a chill ran down his spine. The driver's seat was empty, and the keys were still in the ignition. On the passenger seat lay a woman's purse, spilled open, its contents scattered across the seat makeup, a phone, and a small notebook. It looked as though someone had left in a hurry. Ethan picked up the phone, but it was dead. He called out again, louder this time. "Hello? Are you okay?" The only reply was the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. He scanned the edge of the woods, trying to see if anyone was out there, but the darkness seemed to swallow everything beyond a few feet. He decided it was best to call the police. As he pulled out his phone and started dialing, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of a branch snapping, coming from the woods. Every instinct screamed at Ethan to get back on his bike and leave. But what if someone was hurt and needed help? He switched on his flashlight and aimed it toward the source of the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees, shrubs, and shadows. "Hello? If you're out there, I can help," he shouted, but only silence answered. Torn between staying and leaving, Ethan took a step closer to the woods, shining his light around. That's when he saw a movement just beyond the beam of his flashlight. It was fast, almost like a person darting behind a tree. "Hey, wait," he called out, taking another step. The flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, Ethan felt like he was being watched closely. When the light stabilized, he scanned the area again. His eyes finally locked onto a figure, a woman standing just at the edge of the beam, barely visible. She was facing away from him, wearing a long white dress that seemed to glow in the moonlight. "Ma'am? Are you okay?" Ethan asked cautiously, trying to keep his voice calm. But she didn't move, didn't acknowledge him in any way. He took a cautious step forward, but as soon as he did, the woman bolted, darting deeper into the woods, her dress trailing behind her like a ghostly apparition. Without thinking, Ethan ran after her, shouting for her to stop. The flashlight beam bobbed wildly as he ran, casting shadows that twisted and danced around him. He ran for what felt like ages, but the woman was always just out of reach, disappearing deeper into the dark. Finally, out of breath and disoriented, Ethan stopped. He realized he had no idea where he was. The road was nowhere in sight, and the thick canopy of trees blocked out the moonlight, plunging the woods into near-complete darkness. Trying to steady his breathing, he spun around, desperately searching for any sign of the woman or a path back to the road. But the forest seemed endless, and the silence was deafening. And then he heard a faint whisper, like someone speaking just inches from his ear. "Help me," it said, so softly he wasn't sure if he'd imagined it. He whipped around, shining his flashlight in all directions, but there was no one there. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Please help me." Panicking, Ethan bolted in the direction he thought would lead him back to the road. Branches clawed at his face, roots tripped him up, and every step seemed to take him deeper into the woods. But he didn't stop. He ran until he could see the glow of the road's streetlights through the trees. Relief washed over him as he finally broke free from the woods, stumbling onto the pavement. Breathing heavily, Ethan made his way back to his bike. He looked around for the car with the hazard lights, but to his shock, it was gone. The road was empty, as if the car and the woman had never been there at all. He stood there, stunned, trying to make sense of what just happened. He checked his phone. It was past midnight, and he realized he'd been in the woods for over an hour, though it felt like minutes. Still shaken, Ethan rode home, his mind racing with questions. He didn't sleep that night, the whispers echoing in his head and the image of the woman's white dress burned into his memory. The next day, Ethan decided to report the incident to the police, just in case someone was truly in danger. The officer listened intently, jotting down notes as Ethan described the events of the previous night. But when Ethan mentioned the abandoned car, the officer's expression turned serious. "A silver sedan, you said?" he asked. Ethan nodded. The officer pulled out a file from his desk and handed it to him. Inside was a photo of a young woman with long brown hair, wearing a white dress. "That's her," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "That's the woman I saw." The officer took a deep breath. "That's not possible," he said, his voice heavy with disbelief. "She's been missing for over a year. Her car was found abandoned on that road last summer, but she was never seen again." Ethan's hands trembled as he put the file down. He left the station, feeling more lost than ever. Every night since, he's avoided that road, but he still hears the whispers, soft, desperate pleas for help, and wonders if he'll ever find out what really happened on that midnight ride. Carla worked the late-night shift at a 24-hour gas station just outside of Pittsburgh. It wasn't the safest of jobs, but it paid well, and her hours worked with her school schedule. Most nights were quiet, filled with the dull hum of fluorescent lights, the rhythmic buzz of the refrigerators, and the occasional customer grabbing snacks or gas. But one Thursday night in November, something happened that Carla would never forget. It was a little past 2 a.m., and the station was deserted. Carla sat behind the counter, scrolling through her phone, fighting to stay awake. Outside, the wind howled through the empty pumps, and leaves scuttled across the concrete like hurried little creatures. The night felt unusually heavy, like something was hanging in the air. The door's automatic chime jolted Carla out of her boredom. A man had walked in, wearing a long coat that brushed against the floor, the hood pulled up to hide his face. He was too tall to be comfortable inside the cramped store and moved with an odd, lumbering gait, like he wasn't used to being in his own skin. "Hello," Carla said, trying to sound friendly, but her voice wavered slightly. The man didn't respond. He just stood there in the middle of the store, unmoving, as if he were listening for something. She watched as he turned his head slowly, scanning the aisles, and then began to walk in long, slow strides toward the back of the store, where the refrigerators held rows of bottled water and sodas. Carla's stomach twisted. There was something wrong about him, something that set off alarm bells in her mind. She could feel her pulse quickening. She kept an eye on him through the convex mirror position behind the counter. He was just standing there, staring at the rows of drinks, but not actually taking anything. After a few minutes, Carla cleared her throat. "Do you need any help finding something?" she asked, her voice more confident than she felt. The man slowly turned around, and Carla finally saw his face under the hood. Pale, expressionless, with hollow, sunken eyes that seemed to look right through her. He didn't blink, didn't smile, just stared. Carla felt a chill crawl down her spine. She fought to maintain eye contact, but found herself looking away, unable to bear the intensity of his gaze. "If you need anything, just let me know," she added awkwardly, pretending to busy herself with some receipts. The man continued to stand there for what felt like an eternity before he finally began moving. He wandered down the aisles slowly, his fingers trailing over the shelves but never picking anything up. He paused at the display of candy bars, then the chips, then the canned goods, always stopping, staring, touching, but never buying. Every so often, Carla could hear him muttering to himself, a low, almost guttural sound that she couldn't make out. She strained to listen, but the words were indecipherable, like a language she didn't understand. And whenever she tried to meet his eyes again, he was already looking right at her, with that same unnerving stare. Carla's anxiety grew as the minutes dragged on. She thought about calling her manager but dismissed the idea. What could she say? That a weird guy was shopping at 2 a.m. It wasn't a crime. She tried to shake off her fear and reason with herself maybe he was just homeless, or someone passing through who didn't know how to act around people. She just needed to get through the rest of her shift. But then the man did something that made Carla's blood run cold. He walked to the counter and placed both hands on it, leaning forward until his face was just inches away from hers. Carla's breath hitched as she got a closer look at him. His skin was ashen, almost gray, and his eyes, up close, looked dark and lifeless. And then he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Are you alone?" Carla's throat went dry. She forced a smile and tried to sound casual. "No, my coworker's just in the back," she lied, praying that he would believe her. The man didn't move. He just stared, his expression unchanged. And then, slowly, ever so slowly, a smile crept across his face, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a smile that felt wrong. "Liar," he hissed, the word dripping with something sinister. Carla felt like she'd been slapped. She stepped back instinctively, her hand fumbling for the panic button under the counter. But before she could press it, the man abruptly turned and walked out of the store, the chime echoing as the door swung shut behind him. Carla stood frozen, staring at the door, half expecting him to come back inside. Her hands shook as she finally pressed the panic button, alerting the local police. She quickly locked the door, her heart racing as she dialed 911. A man was just here, and he was acting strange. "He knew I was alone," she blurted out to the dispatcher, trying to keep her voice steady. The dispatcher stayed on the line with her until the police arrived. When they did, they checked the store, the parking lot, and the surrounding area, but the man was gone. Carla described him as best as she could: tall, pale, and unsettling, but without any security cameras to record the encounter, there wasn't much the officers could do. They promised to keep an eye out and offered to stay with her until her shift ended, but that didn't ease her nerves. The image of the man's face, the way he stared right through her, was burned into her mind. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Carla kept glancing out the windows, half expecting to see the man standing there, watching her. But the parking lot remained empty, and eventually, dawn broke, bathing the station in a warm, reassuring light. Carla didn't sleep that day. She couldn't stop thinking about what the man had said, how he knew she was alone, how he smiled like he enjoyed scaring her. The next night, she called in sick, and then the night after that. When she finally returned to work, it was on the condition that she would only take the day shift. No more nights, no more long hours spent in that empty gas station, waiting for someone to come back. Weeks passed, and Carla slowly settled back into a routine. She convinced herself that the man was just some drifter, passing through on a lonely road. But one night, as she was leaving the station after her shift, she noticed something on the side of the building scratched into the brick in thin, jagged lines. It was hard to read, but as Carla moved closer, her heart dropped. The message was simple, and it sent a wave of terror through her. "I'll see you again, Dot." She backed away, staring at the words, feeling the familiar chill of his presence, even though he was nowhere to be seen. From that night on, Carla always looked over her shoulder, always checked every aisle before closing, and never stayed alone at work after dark. But no matter how many precautions she took, she could never shake the feeling that, somewhere out there, the man was watching, waiting, and that one day he'd keep his promise and come back for her. Aiden had always loved the great outdoors. He was the type of guy who thrived on the freedom of an open sky, the isolation of the forest, and the thrill of camping solo. It was how he cleared his head and recharged from the pressures of everyday life. So when he found a long weekend in his calendar, he grabbed his gear and headed to Blackwater National Forest, a vast, untamed expanse of wilderness in northern Oregon. The forest was known for its beauty and seclusion. Popular trails were scattered throughout, but there were plenty of unmarked paths for those looking for an adventure, which was exactly what Aiden wanted. The weather was perfect, cool, clear, and still. He hiked for hours before finding the perfect spot to pitch his tent, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, far away from any marked trails or other campers. He felt at peace as he set up his camp, built a small fire, and settled in to watch the sun set behind the trees. As darkness fell, Aiden sat by his campfire, roasting a few marshmallows and listening to the sounds of the forest. The crackling of the fire, the distant hooting of an owl, and the rustling of leaves in the breeze made him feel deeply content. But as the night grew darker and the fire began to die down, he noticed something strange, a sound that didn't belong. It was faint at first, like a rhythmic tapping, and then it stopped. He brushed it off as just some animal in the distance and climbed into his tent. The tapping returned as he lay in his sleeping bag, louder this time. It was steady, deliberate, like someone knocking on wood. Aiden unzipped his tent and peered out. The forest was pitch black except for the dying embers of his fire. He shone his flashlight around the clearing, but there was nothing, no sign of an animal, no movement. The tapping ceased, and the night went quiet once more. Shaking his head at his own paranoia, he zipped up the tent and fell asleep. The next morning, the forest felt peaceful again. Aiden shook off the unease from the night before and spent the day exploring the area, following animal tracks, and gathering firewood for the coming night. He marveled at how alone he was. There were no other hikers, no sign of human life, and that's what made it perfect. As evening fell, Aiden built another fire and enjoyed a simple dinner under the stars. The night grew colder, and the wind whispered through the trees. He felt that sense of deep contentment once again. But just as he was about to turn in for the night, the tapping returned. This time it was louder, clearer, and closer. Aiden stood up and called out, "Hello? Is someone out there?" His voice echoed through the forest, but there was no reply. Grabbing his flashlight, he shone it into the woods, trying to find the source of the noise. And then he saw a flash of movement, a figure darting behind a tree just outside of the clearing. His breath caught in his throat. "Hey, who's there?" he shouted, his voice wavering between anger and fear. No response, just the sound of footsteps crunching on leaves, circling the edge of his campsite. Whoever it was, they were staying just out of sight, moving quickly and silently through the woods. Aiden's mind raced with questions. Why would someone be out here in the middle of nowhere? Were they lost? Or were they deliberately trying to mess with him? The footsteps stopped suddenly, and the forest fell silent. Aiden scanned the perimeter with his flashlight, his heart pounding, but he saw nothing. He waited for what felt like hours, straining to hear any sign of movement. Finally, he decided to try and sleep, hoping that whatever it was would leave him alone. He climbed into his tent, but this time, he kept his flashlight and hunting knife by his side. The minutes ticked by in tense silence until, just as he was beginning to drift off, the tapping began again, louder, closer, almost right next to his tent. Aiden bolted upright, gripping his knife tightly. "Show yourself," he yelled, but the tapping continued relentless, like it was taunting him. Aiden unzipped the tent door in one swift motion, brandishing his flashlight and knife. But the beam revealed nothing, just trees and darkness. The tapping stopped, and the silence was deafening. He stood there, trembling, trying to steady his breath, when he noticed something on a tree just a few feet away. He moved closer, and his flashlight illuminated a chilling sight: carvings. Dozens of deep gouges were etched into the bark of the tree, strange symbols, spirals, and shapes that seemed to be scratched into the wood with something sharp. Aiden's blood ran cold as he looked around and realized the carvings were on several trees surrounding his campsite. Someone had marked the area, and it wasn't recent. Whoever had done this had been there before. He quickly packed up his things, the urgency to leave overpowering his sense of adventure. As he dismantled his tent and doused the fire, he kept hearing faint sounds: twigs snapping, leaves crunching as if someone were circling him, always just out of sight. He couldn't see them, but he could feel their presence, like eyes watching his every move. Aiden decided to hike out, even though it was well past midnight. He didn't care about the darkness or the risks of traveling at night, he just needed to leave. He threw on his backpack, grabbed his gear, and took off down the unmarked path he came in on, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the dense forest. As he made his way through the woods, the tapping followed. It echoed through the trees, like it was keeping pace with him, always just behind, but never revealing itself. He tried to move faster, but every step seemed to be met with that haunting rhythm, like a drumbeat echoing his fear. After hours of walking, Aiden finally found the main trail and ran as fast as he could toward the parking lot. His legs ached and his breath was ragged, but the fear drove him forward. When he finally reached his car, he threw his gear in the back and sped off, not stopping until he was miles away from the forest. It took Aiden weeks to calm down, to sleep without waking up to phantom sounds. He told his friends what happened, but they laughed it off as overactive imagination or the forest playing tricks on him. But Aiden knew what he had heard, what he had seen. The carvings on the trees, the relentless tapping, and that feeling of being watched. It wasn't just the forest. Someone had been out there and they didn't want him there. Years later, Aiden would hear rumors of other hikers who had gone to Blackwater National Forest and experienced strange events: disappearing items, strange noises, and mysterious symbols carved into trees. And though Aiden never returned to the forest, he knew that whoever or whatever was out there was still waiting in the woods, marking their territory and haunting the silence with their tapping. When Emma moved into her new apartment in Brooklyn, she felt like her life was finally coming together. The building was charming, a brick walk-up with ivy climbing up its sides, located on a quiet street away from the bustle of the city. It was the kind of place she'd always dreamed of living. The rent was surprisingly affordable, and the landlord, Mr. Cooper, seemed pleasant enough, a retired man who was eager to rent out the last available unit on the 4th floor. The apartment itself was cozy, with hardwood floors, a small but functional kitchen, and a view that overlooked the nearby park. She loved everything about it. The first few weeks went by without incident, and Emma quickly settled into her new routine: morning runs in the park, quiet nights reading in her living room, and the occasional dinner out with friends. But soon, Emma noticed some strange things. It started with noises, soft but distinct footsteps coming from the apartment above hers. The sound of pacing, like someone walking back and forth for hours, sometimes late into the night. She thought nothing of it at first. After all, it was an old building, and sounds tended to carry through the thin walls and floors. One night, when the footsteps were particularly loud, Emma decided to mention it to Mr. Cooper. She met him in the lobby as he was checking the mail. "Hey, do you know who lives in the apartment above mine?" she asked. "I hear footsteps at odd hours. It sounds like they're pacing." Mr. Cooper frowned, looking genuinely confused. "There's no one living above you, dear," he said. "That apartment's been vacant for over a year." Emma was taken aback. "Are you sure? Because I hear someone up there almost every night." Mr. Cooper's expression softened into a dismissive smile. "This building is old. Sounds travel strangely. I wouldn't worry about it." He walked away, leaving Emma with a creeping sense of unease. That night, she tried to ignore the noises, convincing herself that it was all in her head. But as the nights went on, the footsteps continued. Not only that, they seemed to be getting louder and more erratic, sometimes running, sometimes a slow, steady pacing. Emma tried to sleep with earplugs, but the noises seemed to cut right through them, as if they were happening just on the other side of her wall. One particularly restless night, Emma decided she had to see for herself. She couldn't take the not knowing anymore. Clad in her pajamas and armed with her phone flashlight, she tiptoed up the creaky stairs to the apartment above hers. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the door labeled 5 billion. She hesitated before knocking, feeling silly for disturbing what was probably an empty apartment. But she had to know. Knock, knock, knock. No answer. She pressed her ear against the door, holding her breath. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. And then, from inside, she heard the distinct sound of someone shuffling around, like they were just a few feet away. Emma's breath hitched, and she knocked again, louder this time. "Hello? Is someone in there?" Again, there was no answer, just more shuffling, followed by what sounded like a soft, barely audible sigh. Emma's hand shook as she reached for the doorknob. To her surprise, it turned easily. The door wasn't locked. Swallowing her fear, she slowly pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly in the otherwise silent hallway. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness of the apartment, revealing an empty living room covered in dust. The air was stale, and it was clear that no one had lived there for a long time. But then what was making the noise? Emma stepped inside, shining her light around. The place was completely bare, no furniture, no signs of recent habitation, just dust and shadows. As she explored the apartment, her nerves on edge, she noticed something odd on the floor, a trail of footprints in the dust, leading from the living room to a closet door in the far corner. She followed the prints, her heart racing as she approached the closet. She reached for the door handle, but then froze. From inside the closet, she could hear a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone's fingers drumming lightly on wood. Tap, tap, tap. Emma's hand trembled as she yanked the door open, but there was nothing inside, just an empty, dusty closet. The tapping stopped instantly, and a wave of cold air seemed to wash over her. Confused and scared, Emma backed out of the apartment, slamming the door shut behind her, and rushed downstairs to her own unit. She tried to convince herself that she was imagining things, that it was just her tired mind playing tricks on her. But the next day, she called the landlord again, demanding to know more about the apartment above. Mr. Cooper sounded annoyed by her persistence, but finally relented. Look, there used to be a tenant up there, he admitted, his voice low. A young woman, she, had some issues. One day she just disappeared. No one knows what happened to her. The police never found any trace. Why didn't you tell me this before? Emma asked, her voice trembling. It wasn't relevant, Mr. Cooper replied curtly. Besides, the place has been empty ever since. I'm sure it's just the building settling or something. Try not to let your imagination run wild. Emma hung up, feeling both frustrated and terrified. She didn't believe it was just the building settling. She could feel it, there was something wrong with that apartment. The following week, things escalated. It wasn't just the footsteps anymore. Emma started hearing whispers, soft, frantic voices that seemed to echo through the floor, always just out of earshot, as if someone were desperately trying to communicate but couldn't. And sometimes she would hear scratching like nails dragging against wood, coming from the ceiling right above her bed. She began to dread coming home, feeling a constant sense of being watched, of not being alone. One night, after tossing and turning in bed, she heard a soft knock on her door. She bolted upright, her heart pounding. Who's there? She called out, but the knocking continued slow, deliberate. She grabbed her phone, hands shaking, and rushed to the door. But when she looked through the peephole, there was no one there. The knocking stopped, and all that was left was silence. The next morning, exhausted and on edge, Emma decided she couldn't take it anymore. She packed up her things, called Mr. Cooper, and told him she was leaving. She didn't care about breaking the lease or losing her deposit, she just needed to get out. Mr. Cooper didn't seem surprised when she told him. I understand, was all he said. Emma moved out that day, leaving behind the cozy apartment she had once loved. She never returned to the building, but sometimes she found herself wondering about the tenant who had disappeared. Had she really just vanished? Or was she still there, pacing back and forth in that empty apartment, trying to reach out to anyone who would listen? And on some nights when Emma lay awake in her new place, she would hear it a soft tapping, like fingers drumming lightly on wood, and she would wonder if, somehow, whatever haunted that apartment had followed her, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. Chris was a runner. Every morning and night, he would lace up his shoes and hit the pavement, winding through the empty streets of his small town in Oregon. He loved the solitude, the rhythmic sound of his breath, and the way the world felt like it belonged only to him. The only times he felt truly at peace were those miles in the dark before dawn or just after midnight, when no one else was around. One night, Chris decided to take a different route, a path that cut through the edge of town and ran parallel to the abandoned railway tracks. It was a longer, quieter route that he'd always meant to try, and tonight seemed like the perfect night for an adventure. The air was crisp and cool, the moon bright enough to light his way without a flashlight. He set off at his usual steady pace, the pounding of his shoes against the ground comforting in its familiarity. The houses grew sparse as he ran toward the outskirts of town, and soon it was just him, the empty tracks, and the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees. Chris lost himself in the run, pushing his body and clearing his mind. He was about 3 miles in when he noticed a soft, distant whistle. It was faint, barely louder than a breath, but it was there, cutting through the silence of the night. He stopped, pulling out his earbuds, thinking it was just an echo of some noise from town, but it came again, clearer this time. A train whistle. Chris frowned. The tracks had been abandoned for years. No trains had run through them for as long as he could remember. He listened closely, turning his head toward the source of the sound. It seemed to come from further down the tracks, a gentle wail that sent a shiver down his spine. He glanced up and down the tracks but saw nothing, only the overgrown weeds and twisted rails stretching into darkness. Deciding it was nothing, he continued on his run, but the whistle persisted, hauntingly mournful and growing louder. It felt as if it were following him, matching his pace, always just out of sight. Chris tried to ignore it, to focus on his run, but the sound dug into his mind, making the hair on the back of his neck stand up. A mile later, the sound changed. It wasn't just the whistle anymore, it was the sound of wheels on tracks, the rhythmic clattering of an approaching train. Chris stopped, turning to face the tracks. The sound was unmistakable now, but still, there was nothing. He stood there, squinting into the distance, expecting to see a train emerge from the darkness, but the tracks remained empty. The clattering grew louder and louder, like a train was barreling straight toward him, but there was no light, no movement, just the deafening noise rushing at him from all sides. Panicked, Chris backed away from the tracks, his pulse racing. He kept looking up and down, expecting to be hit at any moment, but the noise suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was so thick, it felt like the whole world had gone mute. Chris stood frozen, his eyes darting around in the dark, trying to make sense of what he'd heard. He shook his head, trying to calm himself. Maybe he was just tired, or his mind was playing tricks on him. He forced himself to start running again, determined to finish his route. But now every step felt heavy, every shadow seemed to move, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. As he ran, he kept stealing glances over his shoulder, and that's when he saw a figure standing in the distance, just off the tracks. A man, tall and thin, dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned conductor's uniform. The figure stood perfectly still, watching him, and even though he was too far away to see clearly, Chris felt the man's eyes locked on him. Heart pounding, Chris quickened his pace, glancing back only to see the figure growing closer, as if it were following him down the tracks. He broke into a full sprint, pushing his body to its limits, the world around him blurring as he ran. But no matter how fast he ran, the figure seemed to keep pace, always just far enough away to be out of reach, but close enough to make sure Chris knew he was being followed. Finally, Chris veered off the path and cut through a dense thicket of trees, hoping to lose the figure in the darkness. Branches scratched at his arms and face as he crashed through the underbrush, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He ran until his lungs burned, until he was sure he'd lost him. When he finally stopped, he was deep in the woods, far from the tracks and the eerie figure. He stood there, hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath and steady his racing heart. After a few minutes, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. Whatever had happened back there, it was over. He'd made it out. That's when he heard it again, the whistle, soft and mournful, coming from directly behind him. Chris spun around, and there he was, the man in the conductor's uniform, standing not 10 feet away. This time, Chris could see his face clearly. His eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to swallow the light, and his mouth was twisted into a wide, unnatural smile. The man raised his hand, pointing a long, bony finger at Chris, and for a moment they just stared at each other, frozen in time. And then the world around Chris seemed to collapse. The sound of a train roared to life, louder than anything he'd ever heard. The trees around him blurred and twisted, and he felt the ground tremble beneath his feet, like the train was passing right through him. He stumbled back, covering his ears, and when he opened his eyes again, the conductor was gone, and the forest was silent once more. Chris ran all the way home without stopping, his legs fueled by pure adrenaline. When he finally got back to his house, he locked the doors and windows, the whistle echoing in his ears as he tried to calm down. He couldn't sleep that night. He kept replaying the events over and over in his mind, wondering what he'd seen, what he'd heard. The next day, Chris did some research. He dug through old newspapers and local history sites, trying to find out more about the abandoned tracks. What he discovered chilled him to the bone. Decades ago, a train had derailed on that very line, killing dozens of passengers, including the conductor, a man known for his dedication to his job, who had been seen pacing the tracks, waving his lantern and trying to stop the runaway train before it crashed. Since that day, rumors had spread about sightings of a ghostly figure along the tracks always at night, always following those who wandered too close. They called him the Midnight Conductor, a restless soul still trying to fulfill his duty long after death. Chris hasn't gone on a night run since, and sometimes when the wind is just right and the night is quiet, he swears he can hear the faint sound of a whistle in the distance, calling out to him, beckoning him back to the tracks. Tara's family owned a small cabin in the mountains of Colorado, deep in the woods near a lake called Stillwater. It was a place she had loved ever since she was a child, rustic, quiet, and far away from civilization. After a stressful year at work, she decided to spend a long weekend up there alone to unwind and clear her head. It had been years since she last visited, and she looked forward to the familiar creak of the wooden floors, the scent of pine, and the peaceful isolation. She drove up on a Friday morning, her car packed with enough supplies to last the weekend. The weather was perfect, clear blue skies, a gentle breeze, and just the right amount of chill in the air. When she finally reached the cabin, she felt an overwhelming sense of relief. This was exactly what she needed: a break from city life, from stress, from people. The first day passed without incident. Tara unpacked, took a walk down to the lake, and sat on the dock, letting the calm waters soothe her nerves. As the sun set, she made a small fire in the cabin's fireplace and curled up with a book. Everything was as she remembered it, and it felt like coming home. But that night, as she was getting ready for bed, she heard a faint knock at the door. It was soft, like someone tapping gently with their knuckles. She froze, her toothbrush halfway to her mouth. The cabin was miles from the nearest town, and no one knew she was there. She stood still, listening closely, but the knocking didn't come again. She peered through the window, but all she could see was darkness. Trying to shake off her nerves, Tara decided it was just the wind or an animal, and she went to bed. She slept uneasily, waking up several times throughout the night, each time straining her ears for any sound. But all she heard was the occasional creaking of the cabin settling and the rustling of leaves outside. The next day, Tara tried to forget about the strange knocking. She hiked along an old trail she used to love, cooked herself a nice dinner, and sat out on the porch, listening to the sounds of the forest. But as the sun set and the shadows lengthened, the sense of unease returned. She found herself glancing at the door, half expecting to hear that knocking again. And she did. It was around midnight when she heard it, 3 gentle knocks, like someone testing to see if she was awake. Tara's heart raced as she approached the door. "Hello," she called out, her voice shaking. "Who's there?" There was no reply, just the soft whisper of the wind through the trees. Against her better judgment, Tara unlocked the door and opened it. The cool night air rushed in, but the porch was empty. She shone her flashlight around, illuminating the clearing in front of the cabin, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. She shut the door, double-locked it this time, and went back to bed, her heart pounding as she pulled the covers up to her chin. The next morning, as Tara made coffee, she noticed something odd on the front porch. A small pile of rocks, carefully stacked in a neat column, sat right by the door. She stared at it, confused and unnerved. She hadn't put the rocks there. And it certainly wasn't there when she arrived. Someone must have come up to the cabin while she was asleep. Tara's nerves were frayed. She spent the day trying to rationalize what was happening. Maybe it was just a prank by some local kids. Or maybe an animal had knocked on the door, and she was overreacting. She kept telling herself these things, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave her. That evening, as the sky turned to twilight, Tara sat inside, gripping her phone. She was ready to call someone, anyone, if the knocking happened again. And it did. This time it was louder, more insistent. 4 sharp knocks, like someone pounding on the door. Tara jumped up, her breath catching in her throat. "Who is it?" she shouted, trying to sound braver than she felt. There was no answer. Her fingers fumbled as she dialed 911, but just as she was about to hit call, the knocking stopped. Everything was silent. She held her breath, listening for any sound, but there was nothing. A minute later, her phone vibrated with a notification. She looked down, expecting a message from a friend or an update from one of her apps, but instead saw an unfamiliar number. A text message with no words, just a photo. Tara's hands shook as she opened the message. It was a picture of her, standing in the cabin, looking at her phone. Taken just seconds ago. Her blood ran cold. She dropped her phone, scrambling to lock all the windows and barricade the door. Someone was out there, watching her, and they knew she was alone. She grabbed a heavy kitchen knife, her eyes darting around the cabin as she tried to figure out what to do. She couldn't call the police, they were too far away to help her in time. She couldn't leave her car was parked too far from the cabin, and she had no idea where the person was hiding. She backed herself into the corner of the living room, gripping the knife tightly. The minutes dragged on in agonizing silence. Tara's mind raced with fear, every small creak and groan of the cabin making her jump. And then after what felt like hours, she heard the sound of footsteps, slowly approaching the front door. Tara's breath hitched as she saw the doorknob slowly start to turn. The door was locked, but whoever was on the other side was persistent, rattling it back and forth, testing its strength. She raised the knife, her hands shaking, ready to defend herself. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. The person on the other side of the door seemed to walk away, leaving Tara trembling in the corner. She stayed there, paralyzed with fear, for the rest of the night, listening for any sound, any movement. When the first light of dawn broke through the windows, Tara finally summoned the courage to move. She peeked through the curtains, praying the person was gone. And they were. The clearing was empty, and the forest was quiet. She grabbed her keys, her bag, and ran to her car, not stopping to look back as she sped down the dirt road that led away from the cabin. It wasn't until she was miles away, back on the main road, that she dared to look at her phone again. There were no more messages, no more photos. Whoever had been stalking her seemed to have disappeared as quickly as they had come. But one thing still haunted her. When she checked her camera roll, she found one more photo, one she didn't take. It was a picture of the cabin's living room, empty except for the small pile of rocks that now sat inside, stacked neatly on the floor. Tara never returned to the cabin. She couldn't explain what happened that night, who was out there, or why they chose her. And she never found out how they managed to get inside, leave the rocks, and vanish without a trace. Jake loved finding bargains online. Craigslist was his go-to place for scoring cheap deals, from used guitars to vintage cameras. So when he stumbled upon a high-end gaming computer listed for half its retail price, it seemed too good to pass up. The ad was brief gaming PC, barely used, $500 oboe, and included just one grainy photo of a black desktop tower. Jake didn't need to see more, he was sold. He quickly contacted the seller, who responded within minutes. They agreed to meet at the seller's house that evening. When Jake arrived at the address, it was a rundown townhouse in a part of town he wasn't familiar with. The front yard was overgrown with weeds, and the porch light flickered like it was on its last legs. As he approached the door, a middle-aged man in a hoodie opened it before Jake could even knock. "You here for the computer?" the man asked, glancing around nervously like he was expecting trouble. Jake nodded, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling settling in his stomach. The man ushered him inside, and they walked into the living room. It was dimly lit, cluttered with old furniture, and smelled faintly of mildew. But there it was, the gaming PC, sitting on a scratched-up coffee table, looking brand new and out of place in the shabby room. "It works great," the man said quickly, as if trying to rush the sale. "I just need to get rid of it. Personal reasons." Jake powered on the computer, checked a few specs, and everything seemed to check out. It was a steal. They exchanged cash, and Jake hauled the tower to his car. The man didn't say goodbye, just closed the door as soon as the money was in his hands. Jake shrugged it off, chalking up the strange behavior to the man just wanting a quick sale. When Jake got home, he set up the computer, excited to test its capabilities. It booted up quickly, and everything seemed to be in order. He installed his favorite games, tested the graphics, and marveled at how smoothly everything ran. But as he was exploring the files on the desktop, he noticed a folder buried deep in the hard drive labeled do_not_open. Curiosity got the better of him. He clicked on the folder, expecting to find old documents or perhaps some hidden system files. Instead, it contained hundreds of videos, short, shaky clips, all titled with dates. The most recent was from the day before. Feeling a strange mix of excitement and unease, Jake opened one of the videos. The screen flickered to life, showing a dark room, the camera focused on a person sleeping. The footage was grainy, like it was taken from a webcam or a hidden camera. Jake felt his pulse quicken as he clicked through several more videos. Each one was similar, different people in different rooms, all sleeping, all unaware that they were being recorded. Some clips lasted only a few minutes, others were hours long, showing nothing but the rise and fall of chests as the subject slept. Jake's stomach twisted as he clicked on one of the later videos. This time, the camera wasn't in a dark bedroom, it was in a car. It showed a man, presumably the seller, driving aimlessly through a neighborhood. He seemed anxious, constantly checking his mirrors, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The camera angle was strange, almost as if it were placed on the dashboard without him knowing. Jake shut the video off, feeling like he was invading someone's privacy, but he couldn't stop himself from watching one more. He scrolled down to the most recent file, the one from the day before. It was the longest clip in the folder, over an hour, and the thumbnail showed nothing but darkness. With shaking hands, he clicked play. The video started as a black screen. Jake strained to see anything, but the camera seemed to be covered or obscured by something. He could hear muffled shuffling, the rustling of clothes, and what sounded like heavy breathing. After a minute, the camera adjusted and he could make out shapes, furniture, the outline of a room, and then a person. Jake's heart stopped as he recognized the room. It was his room, and the person on the screen was him, sitting at his computer, setting it up earlier that day. The camera angle was from behind, like someone had been standing in his doorway, recording him without his knowledge. He frantically looked around, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He rewound the video and watched again, his stomach flipping as he saw himself on screen, oblivious to the fact that he was being filmed. His eyes darted back to the video, and his breath caught in his throat as the camera panned closer. The person holding it walked silently across his living room, stopping just outside his bedroom door, recording him from mere feet away. Jake paused the video, adrenaline pumping through his veins. How was this possible? He had been alone all day, or so he thought. Jake's hands trembled as he got up from his desk, checking every corner of his apartment. He looked under the bed, in the closets, and even checked behind the shower curtain, but found nothing. He closed and locked every door, trying to steady his nerves. He went back to the computer, took a deep breath, and hit play. The video continued, the camera still focused on him. And then suddenly it shifted, turning toward the window in his living room. The blinds were closed, but there was just enough space to see outside. And there, standing in the darkness, was a figure, a person watching from the shadows. The camera zoomed in, and Jake could see the faint outline of a face, pale and expressionless, staring into his apartment. Jake slammed his laptop shut, his heart pounding like a drum. He dialed 911, stumbling over his words as he explained the situation to the dispatcher. The police arrived within minutes, searching the apartment and the surrounding area, but whoever had been watching was long gone. They took the computer and all its files as evidence, promising to investigate further. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. Jake couldn't stop thinking about the figure outside his window, or the fact that someone had been inside his home without him knowing. The police eventually got back to him, but they didn't have any answers. The seller was gone, the phone number disconnected, and the address he gave was a fake. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Jake tried to move on, but he never felt safe in his own home again. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that somewhere out there, the person who had sold him the computer was still lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make their presence known. And sometimes late at night, when the world was quiet and dark, Jake would hear it, the soft hum of a camera lens adjusting, the faintest click of a shutter, and the unmistakable feeling of being recorded by eyes he couldn't see. Lisa was driving home one evening along a quiet stretch of highway. It was the same route she took every day after work, and though the road was isolated, she always found comfort in its familiarity. But on this particular night, something felt different. The sky was a stormy gray, and a thick fog began to roll in, creeping across the asphalt like a living thing. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, making her shiver despite the car's heater. As she turned a bend, she noticed a car up ahead, a sleek black sedan driving slowly, almost too slowly. She thought it was odd but figured the driver was just being cautious in the fog. Lisa settled in behind the sedan, keeping a safe distance and hoping it would speed up soon. Minutes passed, and the sedan continued at its sluggish pace, almost like it was crawling. Lisa's frustration grew as she checked the time. She was already late, and she didn't have the patience for a slow driver blocking her way. She flashed her high beams as a signal to speed up, but the car didn't respond. It stayed on its steady course, hugging the center line. She decided to pass it. Glancing around, she checked to see if the opposite lane was clear and then pulled out to overtake the sedan. As she drew level with the car, she glanced over, and that's when her blood ran cold. The driver's seat was empty. At first, she thought maybe she had misjudged or imagined it, so she kept her eyes locked on the sedan as she passed it. But no matter how hard she looked, the driver's seat remained vacant. There was no one at the wheel. No head, no hands gripping the steering wheel, just a perfectly empty seat. Panic gripped her. She slammed her foot on the gas pedal, speeding past the sedan and swerving back into her lane. Her heart raced as she tried to rationalize what she had seen. Maybe it was some kind of prank, she thought. But how could that be possible? The car was driving so steadily, not swerving or losing control. She checked her rearview mirror, and there it was, the sedan, still creeping along the road behind her. Lisa's hands trembled on the steering wheel as she kept glancing back at the car, trying to make sense of it. And then, as if to make matters worse, the headlights behind her flickered, flashing brightly as though the car were signaling her. Once, twice, 3 times. Trying to stay calm, Lisa grabbed her phone and dialed 911. As she explained her situation to the dispatcher, the sedan suddenly accelerated, closing the gap between them until it was tailgating her, its headlights flooding her car with blinding light. "Please, someone help," Lisa cried into the phone, her voice cracking with fear. Stay calm and keep driving. "We're sending someone to your location," the dispatcher replied, trying to sound reassuring. "Just don't stop." Lisa gripped the wheel tighter, trying to focus on the road ahead, but the sedan kept flashing its lights, so bright that she could hardly see. It was as if the car were trying to force her to pull over. Every time she glanced in the rearview mirror, the headlights seemed to grow closer and closer until they were practically on top of her bumper. She pressed the gas pedal down further, speeding up to put some distance between her and the sedan. But the faster she drove, the faster the car followed. It stayed right behind her, mimicking her every move, like a shadow she couldn't escape. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Lisa saw the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser up ahead. Relief flooded over her, and she slowed down, waving her arm out the window to signal the officer. She pulled over to the side of the road, and the sedan, now a safe distance behind her, came to a stop as well. The officer approached her window, and she rolled it down frantically. "There's a car behind me," she said, her voice shaking. "It's been following me, and there's no driver. It's empty." The officer frowned and shone his flashlight on the sedan. He approached the car cautiously, tapping on the window, but got no response. After a moment, he turned back to Lisa. "Stay in your car. I'm going to check this out." Lisa watched as he circled the sedan, trying to look inside. He yanked open the driver's side door, and she held her breath, half expecting something or someone to leap out. But there was nothing. The car was completely empty, just as she'd seen. The officer glanced back at her, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. "What is it? Did you see anything?" she called out, unable to stay quiet any longer. The officer shook his head, looking just as baffled as she felt. "It's empty. There's no one inside." He pulled out his radio to call for a tow, but as he did, something strange happened. The sedan's engine roared to life on its own, and the car lurched forward, tires screeching as it barreled down the road, leaving the officer and Lisa in stunned silence. "Did you see that?" Lisa shouted, jumping out of her car. The officer didn't respond right away. He was staring down the road, watching the sedan speed off until it disappeared into the fog. Lisa and the officer exchanged a look, neither knowing what to say. After a long, tense pause, he finally managed to speak. "Get back in your car," he said firmly. "I'll have dispatch send another unit out to find that car. But you, just get home safe." Lisa nodded, her hands shaking as she climbed back into her car. She watched the police cruiser's lights fade away in her rearview mirror as she pulled back onto the road, glancing nervously over her shoulder every few seconds. The fog seemed to close in around her, and every twist and turn in the road felt like it might reveal the black sedan, lying in wait to follow her again. She made it home without seeing the car again, but she never quite felt safe. Every time she drove down that highway, she couldn't help but check her mirrors, half expecting to see the sedan's headlights appear out of the darkness, creeping closer, with no driver in sight. Weeks later, she learned that the police never found the sedan. The officers chalked it up to a prank or a stolen vehicle abandoned somewhere in the woods. But Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister had been behind the wheel that night, or perhaps not behind the wheel at all. And every once in a while, when she drove that lonely stretch of highway, she thought she heard the faint sound of tires rolling over asphalt, creeping ever closer to her in the fog. Lucy loved going to antique shops. There was something magical about finding old treasures, each with its own story, buried under layers of dust and time. One rainy Saturday, she found herself wandering into a small shop on the outskirts of her town. An out-of-the-way place called Old Time Curiosities. The store was packed with old books, clocks, jewelry, and furniture, but one item caught her eye immediately: a painting. It was an oil painting of a beautiful woman in a blue dress, standing in front of a large, old mansion. The detail was exquisite. The artist had captured every fold of the dress, every strand of the woman's long black hair, and even the clouds swirling above the mansion behind her. But what drew Lucy to the painting was the woman's eyes. They were piercing, almost lifelike, and seemed to follow her no matter where she stood. The expression on the woman's face was hard to pin down. Was it a smile, or something more sinister? The price was surprisingly low. When Lucy asked the shopkeeper why it was so cheap, he shrugged and said it had been there for years, and he just wanted it gone. She didn't think much of it, and after some haggling, she left the store with the painting tucked under her arm, feeling like she had found a real hidden gem. She hung the painting in her living room, directly across from the couch where she often sat to read or watch TV. That night, as she settled into her usual spot, she found herself staring at the painting more than she expected. The woman's eyes were so captivating that it felt like they were peering right into her soul. Lucy tried to focus on her book, but she kept looking up at the woman in the blue dress. Something about the expression was unsettling, and no matter how she adjusted her seating, those eyes seemed to follow her. "It's just a painting," she muttered to herself, laughing off the unease that was creeping up her spine. But as the days went on, the painting started to bother her more. She would catch herself glancing at it constantly, almost as if checking to make sure the woman was still there. And every time she looked, it felt like the expression on the woman's face had changed slightly, subtly, almost imperceptibly. The smile seemed to curl more at the edges, the eyes grew darker, and her gaze became more intense, like she was scrutinizing Lucy, judging her. One night, as Lucy lay in bed, she thought she heard a faint scratching sound coming from the living room. She sat up, listening closely, but the noise stopped. Just an old house settling, she reassured herself. But the scratching returned the next night, and the night after that, always soft, rhythmic, like fingernails lightly tapping against wood. By the end of the week, Lucy was too scared to sleep. She would lie awake, staring at the doorway of her bedroom, her ears straining for any sound. And each morning, when she walked into the living room, she felt like the woman in the painting was glaring at her with more disdain, the smile now a twisted smirk. Desperate to get some rest, Lucy decided to move the painting to the attic. She climbed the narrow stairs, pushed open the creaky door, and shoved the painting behind a stack of old boxes. She dusted her hands off, feeling relieved to have the unsettling eyes out of sight. For the first time in days, she slept soundly without waking up to any scratching or strange feelings of being watched. The next day, Lucy went about her routine, relieved to have the painting out of the living room. But that night, the scratching sound returned louder this time and closer. It was as if it were coming from just outside her bedroom door. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, and called out, "Who's there?" Silence. Gathering her courage, she grabbed a flashlight and tiptoed down the hall, scanning the floor for anything that could be making the noise. When she reached the living room, she saw the painting was back on the wall, hung exactly where it had been before. The woman's eyes glaring directly at her, the smile now unmistakably cruel. Lucy's stomach churned. She was certain she had left the painting in the attic. There was no way it could have moved on its own. Feeling more angry than scared, she yanked the painting off the wall, marched it back upstairs, and buried it under even more boxes, this time wedging it tightly behind an old dresser. She locked the attic door, making sure it was secure, and returned to bed, but sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind against the window made her jump, her eyes darting to the bedroom door, half expecting to see the woman from the painting standing there, staring at her. The next morning, Lucy went straight to the attic, determined to prove to herself that she wasn't going crazy. She unlocked the door and swung it open, expecting to see the painting exactly where she'd left it. But it wasn't there. The boxes were undisturbed, the dresser still in place, but the painting was gone. Frantic, she searched the entire attic, throwing open boxes, knocking over furniture, desperate to find the painting. And then she saw it. The painting was leaning against the far wall, propped up carefully, the woman's eyes boring into Lucy's with an almost mocking intensity. The smile was now unmistakably twisted, and it seemed as though the woman's face had aged. Overnight wrinkles lined her eyes, and her hair looked tangled and wild. Terrified, Lucy grabbed the painting and ran downstairs, out the front door, and straight to the backyard. She found a shovel and began digging a deep hole in the corner of the yard, ignoring the way the woman's eyes seemed to follow every movement. She threw the painting into the hole, covered it with dirt, and buried it as deeply as she could. She patted down the earth, hoping that would be the last she'd ever see of it. That night, for the first time in what felt like forever, the house was silent. No scratching, no strange noises, just peace. Lucy finally felt like she could breathe again. But as she drifted off to sleep, she heard something soft, a faint noise coming from the backyard, a sound like fingers dragging across wood, muffled but unmistakable. Morning came, and Lucy tried to convince herself that it was all in her head. She stayed away from the backyard, not wanting to see if the dirt had been disturbed, not wanting to know if the painting had somehow re-emerged. But that evening, as she sat in her living room, she heard a creak behind her. Slowly, she turned around, her breath catching in her throat. There, hanging on the wall, was the painting. The woman's face was twisted into a grotesque sneer, her eyes burning with malice, and the background of the painting had changed. The mansion was no longer in the background. Now it was Lucy's house, clear as day, with her figure standing in the window, painted with the same lifelike detail as the woman. Lucy screamed, yanking the painting off the wall, throwing it to the floor, and smashing it to pieces with a hammer. But as she shattered the canvas and splintered the wood, she felt something wet on her hands. She looked down to see thick, dark red liquid blood oozing out of the frame, covering her hands as soaking into the floorboards. Horrified, Lucy ran to the phone to call the police. But as she dialed, she heard a whisper, soft and cold, coming from the direction of the destroyed painting. "You can't get rid of me," it said, the voice curling around her like smoke. "I'm part of you now." The police found Lucy the next day, sitting in her living room, staring at the broken painting in silence. She couldn't explain to them what had happened, and they chalked it up to stress, exhaustion, and an overactive imagination. But they didn't see what she saw. They didn't see the eyes that still watched her from the remnants of the painting, the smile that continued to grow wider and wider. And even after the police left, after she threw away the broken pieces, Lucy could still feel the woman's presence, always watching, always waiting. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw at the mansion, the blue dress, and those piercing, ever-following eyes. Ellie had just moved into her new apartment, a spacious loft in a converted factory building downtown. The exposed brick, high ceilings, and massive windows had all the charm she could have asked for. It It was perfect, and she couldn't wait to make it her own. It was her first time living alone, and she looked forward to the independence and quiet that came with it. For the first week, everything went smoothly. She spent her days unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and decorating. But then, one night, the calls began. It started with her phone ringing around midnight. Ellie was half asleep, but when she saw No Caller Idaho flash on her screen, she figured it was just a wrong number. She let it go to voicemail, rolled over, and tried to get back to sleep. But the phone rang again, and again. 3 times in a row, the same No Caller Idaho appeared. Groaning, Ellie picked up the phone. "Hello," she answered, her voice groggy. There was silence on the other end, complete and unnerving silence. "Hello," she repeated, louder this time. Still nothing. Just as she was about to hang up, she thought she heard something, a faint sound, like heavy breathing or static. It was so soft that she couldn't be sure if she was imagining it. Frustrated, she hung up and turned off her phone. The next morning, she brushed it off as a prank or a glitch in the system. But that night, the calls started again, always around midnight. Always with No Caller Idaho, she blocked unknown numbers on her phone, hoping it would stop, but the ringing persisted. It went on like this for the rest of the week, night after night. The calls would come through. Sometimes it would be just once, sometimes multiple times, always with silence on the other end. Ellie found herself lying awake, staring at her phone, dreading the sound of it ringing. By Friday, she was exhausted. She spoke to her service provider, who told her they couldn't trace the calls without more information. Feeling desperate, Ellie asked a tech-savvy friend, Mark, to help her figure out who was calling. Mark agreed to come over that night, and they set up a way to trace the call when it came through. Ellie and Mark stayed up late, waiting for the phone to ring. Midnight came and went, and Ellie began to think maybe the calls would finally stop. But at 12:15, her phone lit up with No Caller Idaho. Mark quickly connected his tracing device and nodded for Ellie to pick up. "Hello," she answered, trying to keep her voice steady. This time, there was no silence. Instead, a voice, distorted and low, whispered, "I can see you." Ellie's heart pounded in her chest. "Who is this?" she demanded, trying to sound brave, but her voice trembled. The voice didn't answer. It just continued whispering, over and over, "I can see you. I can see you." The words were drawn out, slow and unsettlingly intimate, like someone speaking directly into her ear. Ellie felt cold sweat trickle down her back as she hung up the phone and looked at Mark. He was staring at his laptop, his face pale. "What is it?" she asked urgently. I traced the call," Mark stammered. "It's coming from inside this building." Ellie's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, inside the building?" Mark pointed to his screen, showing a map of the apartment building. The call was being routed through the same Wi-Fi network that Ellie was connected to, meaning that whoever was calling was close. Very close. She immediately called the police, and they promised to send someone over. As they waited, every sound in the apartment seemed amplified: the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant murmur of traffic outside. Ellie locked all the doors and windows, her heart racing as she tried to figure out who could be calling her. The police arrived within minutes, and they searched the building thoroughly. They checked the halls, the basement, and the stairwell, but found no one suspicious. They suggested that the call might have been coming from another tenant, but there was no way to prove it. They took a statement from Ellie, told her to call again if anything happened, and left. Mark stayed with her that night, sleeping on the couch while she lay awake in her bed, every creak and groan of the old building making her jump. She felt like she was being watched, like eyes were following her every move. But the night passed without incident, and by morning the fear had started to fade. For the next few days, things were quiet. No more calls, no strange sounds, just peace. Ellie convinced herself that maybe it was just a prank, that whoever had been calling had gotten bored and moved on. She started to relax, finally beginning to enjoy her new home again. But on the following Thursday, just as she was getting ready for bed, her phone rang. No caller, Idaho. Ellie's stomach twisted in knots as she stared at the screen. The calls had stopped for so long that she had let her guard down. She hesitated for a moment before picking up. "Hello," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. This time, there was no voice on the other end. Just a faint, rhythmic tapping like fingers drumming on a table. Tap, tap. Ellie felt her skin crawl as the tapping continued, relentless and steady. "Who is this?" she asked, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "What do you want?" The tapping stopped, and a different sound came through, a soft, muffled sound, like fabric being dragged across a surface. And then, a voice calm, steady, and disturbingly familiar whispered, "I'm in your closet." Ellie dropped the phone, her breath catching in her throat. She backed up against the wall, staring at the closed door of her bedroom closet. It was a narrow door, with a small latch lock that she had never bothered to use. She could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears as she fumbled to grab her phone and call 911. The dispatcher answered immediately, and Ellie tried to explain what was happening, but her words came out in a rush, frantic and broken. "There's someone in my closet. Please send help." "Stay on the line, Mom," the dispatcher said calmly. "Officers are on their way. Can you get out of the apartment safely?" Ellie couldn't move. She was paralyzed with fear, her eyes locked on the closet door, half expecting it to swing open at any moment. The seconds felt like hours as she waited, praying for the police to arrive, for the nightmare to end. And then, just as she thought she couldn't take it any longer, she heard the soft click of the closet door latch. The door slowly creaked open, just an inch, and Ellie could see nothing but darkness inside. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles white. "Please, hurry," she whispered into the phone. Sirens blared in the distance, getting louder and louder, and within moments, she heard the sound of heavy footsteps running up the stairs to her apartment. "They're here," the dispatcher said. "Stay on the line." Ellie ran to the front door, throwing it open just as the police arrived. They rushed into the apartment, guns drawn, heading straight for the closet. Ellie stood in the doorway, her body shaking as they flung open the door, flashlights illuminating the inside. But there was no one there. The closet was empty, just rows of clothes and shoes neatly lined up. The police searched the entire apartment, checking every possible hiding place, but they found nothing, no sign of forced entry, no sign that anyone had been there at all. Ellie's relief quickly turned to confusion. "But I heard it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I heard someone. In the closet." The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions skeptical but sympathetic. "Sometimes stress and lack of sleep can play tricks on your mind," one of them suggested. "Maybe you imagined it." They filed a report, reassured her that the building was safe, and eventually left, leaving Ellie alone in her apartment. Alone with the unanswered questions, the fear, and the feeling that she was being watched. The next day, Ellie packed her things and moved out, unable to spend another night in that apartment. She tried to convince herself that it was just a series of strange coincidences, that maybe she really had imagined it all. But even now, in her new place, every time her phone rings, every time she hears a creak or tap in the night, she can't help but wonder. Is it happening again? Is someone still watching her? And every time she looks at her phone, she dreads seeing those words flash across the screen, "No caller ID."